In the fog-choked shadows of Victorian London, a cryptic note slides under Sherlock Holmes's door at 221B Baker Street, its elegant script whispering of a thief known only as the Velvet Mask. Who is this elusive figure, cloaked in mystery, plotting to steal a priceless sapphire diadem from the British Museum? As Holmes and Watson unravel a trail of velvet threads, smudged footprints, and the faint scent of jasmine, they're drawn into a deadly game of cat and mouse. From opulent galas to foggy docks, from underground auctions to a hidden chamber. Beneath the city, each clue reveals a web of corruption spun by a mastermind called the Architect. Will Holmes outwit this shadowy genius, or has he finally met his match? Suspense tightens like a noose as betrayal lurks close, and every step could be a trap in this thrilling tale of deception, vengeance, and the relentless pursuit of truth. Chapter 1. The whisper in the fog draped London like a heavy velvet curtain, muffling the clatter of hooves and the cries of street vendors hawking their wares. It was a November evening in 1891, and the city seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating a secret about to be whispered. At 221B Baker Street, the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the cluttered room where Sherlock Holmes lounged in his armchair, a violin resting idly on his knee. His sharp eyes, usually so piercing, were half-lidded, lost in thought, while I, Dr. John Watson, scribbled notes from our latest case, a mundane affair involving a missing pearl necklace, hardly worthy of Holmes's genius. The clock struck 7, its chime barely audible over the hiss of gas lamps outside. A soft thud at the door broke the silence. Holmes's eyes snapped open, alert as a hawk's. "Watson," he said, his voice low, "our evening is about to become considerably less tedious." I rose, curious, and retrieved a small envelope from beneath the door. It was cream-colored, sealed with crimson wax, and bore no address, only the initials etched in elegant script. I handed it to Holmes, who sliced it open with a letter opener, his movements precise. He unfolded the single sheet within, his brow furrowing as he read. Without a word, he passed it to me. The note was brief, written in a flowing hand. "The Velvet Mask moves tonight. British Museum, Hall of Antiquities, midnight. A treasure will vanish unless you intervene. Trust no one." No signature, no hint of the sender's identity. The words carried an urgency that set my pulse racing. Holmes leaned back, steepling his fingers. "A challenge, Watson, and an intriguing one. The Velvet Mask, what a theatrical moniker. Clearly, our correspondent knows of my methods and seeks to pique my interest. They have succeeded. Do you think it's genuine?" I asked, skeptical. It could be a prank, or worse, a trap. Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Possibly. But the paper is handmade, the ink expensive, and the wax bears a faint crest, a lion rampant, if I'm not mistaken. This is no idle jest. The British Museum, you say? The Hall of Antiquities houses the Elgin marbles, among other treasures. But something tells me our thief has a more specific target." He sprang to his feet, his lethargy banished. "Come, Watson. We have 4 hours until midnight. Time enough to prepare. Bring your revolver. We may need it." The fog thickened as we hailed a hansom cab, its wheels rattling over the cobblestones toward Great Russell Street. Holmes was silent, his mind no doubt racing through possibilities. I, too, pondered the note. The Velvet Mask suggested a figure of mystery, perhaps a master thief cloaked in secrecy. The anonymity of the sender troubled me. Why warn Holmes? Unless they had something to gain? Or was it a diversion meant to lure us into danger? The British Museum loomed through the mist, its neoclassical facade ghostly under the gaslight. We arrived at 10:30, slipping through a side entrance. Holmes knew from a prior case. The night watchman, a grizzled fellow named Jenkins, recognized Holmes and waved us through with a grunt. "Mind the exhibits, Mr. Holmes," he muttered. "Strange goings-on tonight." Saw a shadow moving in the east wing, but it was gone when I looked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "A shadow, you say? Most instructive. Lead on, Jenkins." The Hall of Antiquities was a cavernous space, its high ceilings lost in darkness. Marble statues and ancient relics stood like silent sentinels, their shapes distorted by the fog seeping through high windows. Holmes moved with purpose, his lantern casting a narrow beam across the floor. The note mentioned a treasure. He murmured, "The museum's most valuable artifacts are kept in the central case: Syrian reliefs, Egyptian amulets, and a certain sapphire diadem from the Mycenaean collection reputedly worn by a priestess of Apollo." We reached the central display, a glass case gleaming under the dim light. The diadem sat on a velvet cushion, its sapphires glinting like captured stars. Holmes examined the case, his fingers tracing the edges. "No signs of tampering yet," he said. "But look here, Watson." He pointed to a faint smudge on the glass, barely visible. A fingerprint, perhaps, or a glove's residue. And this, he knelt, retrieving a single thread of deep blue velvet from the floor. Our velvet mask is careless, or perhaps they wish to be noticed. A faint scent lingered in the air jasmine, subtle but distinct. Holmes's nose twitched, an unusual choice for a thief. Jasmine is costly, imported. Our quarry is no common cutpurse. We took positions in the shadows, Holmes near the case, I by a pillar with a clear view of the hall's entrance. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. My revolver felt cold in my hand, and the fog seemed to press closer, as if conspiring with the darkness. At midnight, a distant creak echoed through the hall. Holmes raised a hand, signaling silence. Footsteps, soft but deliberate, approached from the east wing. A figure emerged, a silhouette cloaked in black, moving with feline grace. The face was obscured by a velvet mask, its edges embroidered with a silver crescent that caught the lantern's light. The figure paused, scanning the room, then advanced. Toward the diadem's case, Holmes stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. "Good evening. I presume you are the velvet mask?" The figure froze, then spun, a gloved hand reaching for something at their waist. I raised my revolver, but Holmes signaled me to hold. "No need for violence," he said. "I merely wish to discuss your intentions." The mask's laugh was low, almost musical. "You're as clever as they say, Mr. Holmes, but you're too late." With a swift motion, they hurled a small object to the floor. A blinding flash and a cloud of smoke erupted, choking the air. I coughed, my eyes stinging, and when the smoke cleared, the mask was gone. The case stood open, the diadem untouched, but a small card rested where the velvet thread had been. Holmes snatched it up, his expression darkening. The card bore a single line. "The game begins. Look to the stars." Holmes's jaw tightened. Clever indeed. They staged this to test us, Watson. The diadem was never their target tonight. This was a warning, a declaration of intent. We searched the hall, finding no trace of the mask. Jenkins, roused by the commotion, swore he'd seen no one leave. Holmes examined the card, noting its identical paper and ink to the earlier note. "The same hand," he said. "Our informant and the mask may be connected or one and the same. But the reference to stars. The diadem's sapphires are said to mimic the Pleiades constellation. A clue, perhaps, to their true target." Back at Baker Street, dawn was breaking, the fog thinning to reveal a gray, rain-slicked city. Holmes paced, the card in hand. "The Velvet Mask is no ordinary thief," he said. "They possess resources, knowledge, and a flair for the dramatic. The crescent embroidery suggests a personal symbol, possibly heraldic, and the jasmine only a handful of perfumers in London imported. We shall start there tomorrow." I nodded, exhaustion creeping. "In." "And the diadem? Do we warn the museum?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Oh, the diadem is in danger, but not yet. The mask enjoys the game too much to strike so soon. They've given us a puzzle, Watson, and I intend to solve it. For now, we set a trap. I'll have Lestrade post plainclothes officers at the museum, and we'll trace that jasmine. The Velvet Mask has made their first move. Now it's our turn." As I retired to my room, Holmes stood at the window, gazing into the fading fog. The firelight caught his profile, sharp and resolute, and I knew this was only the beginning of a case that would test even his formidable mind. The Velvet Mask had thrown down the gauntlet, and Sherlock Holmes was ready to answer. The next day, Holmes was up before me, already poring over a stack of perfumery invoices he'd acquired through his network of informants. 3 shops in London import jasmine of this quality," he said, tossing me a list. "Florists, Penelagons, and a small apothecary in Covent Garden. We'll visit the latter first. It's less likely to be watched." The apothecary, a cramped shop tucked behind a flower market, smelled of herbs and oils. The proprietor, a wiry man named Mr. Greaves, confirmed selling jasmine essence to a woman in a veiled hat, paying in cash. "She came thrice this month," he said. "Always at dusk, never showed her face. Bought enough for a dozen bottles of perfume." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Did she leave a name or anything else?" Greaves hesitated, then produced a small receipt. Dropped this. Thought it odd. The receipt was for a tailor in Savile Row, marked with a crestoline rampant. Holmes pocketed it, his expression unreadable. "We're getting closer, Watson." A woman, likely of means, with a taste for discretion. "The tailor will know more." Savile Row was a stark contrast to the apothecary's clutter, its shops lined with polished wood and gleaming brass. The tailor, a Mr. Harrow, recognized the crest immediately. "That's Lady Eleanor Crestwood's mark," he said. "She's ordered several gowns this season, all in dark velvet, peculiar tastes for a widow." Holmes thanked him, and we stepped into the street where the fog was gathering again. "Lady Eleanor Crestwood," Holmes mused. "A recluse, widowed young, with a fortune in gems. She's hosting a gala tomorrow night. The perfect opportunity to observe her and perhaps catch our mask." As we returned to Baker Street, Holmes outlined his plan. We'd attend the gala, posing as guests, to watch Lady Eleanor and search for signs of the Velvet Mask. The note's warning, "Trust no one," echoed in my mind. But Holmes seemed undeterred, his mind alight with the thrill of the chase. The gala was 2 nights away, and Holmes spent the intervening hours in a frenzy of activity cross-referencing guest lists, studying museum blueprints, and even sketching the crescent embroidery from memory. I, meanwhile, prepared my best evening attire, wondering what the night would bring. The velvet mask was out there, a shadow in the fog, and I felt the weight of their gaze, as if they were watching us as closely as we pursued them. That night, as I drifted to sleep, I heard Holmes's violin, its notes haunting and sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. The game had begun, and I knew Sherlock Holmes would not rest until the enigma of the velvet mask was unraveled. Chapter 2. The diadem's disappearance. The fog clung to London streets like a conspirator, muffling the clatter of hooves and the distant cries of newsboys hawking their wares. Inside 221B Baker Street, the air was thick with the scent of tobacco and the faint crackle of the hearth. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes fixed on the cryptic note that had arrived that morning. The elegant script, penned in violet ink, lay unfolded on the table before him, its words etched into his mind. The velvet mask will claim a treasure beneath the museum's watchful gaze. Act swiftly, or lose the prize. Dr. John Watson, ever. The steadfast companion paced near the window, his silhouette framed against the gas-lit gloom outside. Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile. A theatrical touch, Watson. This velvet mask fancies themselves a dramatist, staging their crime with flair. But every performance leaves traces. He rose, his lean frame unfolding with purpose, and gestured to his coat. Come, Watson. The British Museum awaits, and I suspect our quarry has already begun their prelude. The journey to the museum was swift, the hansom cab rattling through streets shrouded in mist. Watson, clutching his revolver beneath his coat, glanced at Holmes, whose eyes gleamed with the quiet intensity of a predator on the hunt. What do you make of this velvet mask, Holmes? A common thief with a penchant for riddles? Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the passing blur of London. Common thieves do not write in violet ink on handmade paper, nor do they warn their pursuers. No, Watson, this is no petty crook. Our opponent is calculated, cultured, and likely reveling in the challenge. The museum's rare artifacts exhibit is vast, but the note's phrasing suggests a specific target. I have my suspicions. At the British Museum, the grand edifice loomed like a sentinel in the fog. The curator, a nervous man named Mr. Hargrove, greeted them with a furrowed brow. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I assure you our security is impeccable. The artifacts are under constant guard, and the exhibit opens tomorrow. A theft would be impossible. Holmes's eyes swept the cavernous hall, noting the polished marble floors, the glass cases glinting under gaslight, and the uniformed guards stationed at intervals. Impossibility is a word for the unimaginative, Mr. Hargrove. Show me the centerpiece of your exhibit. Hargrove led them to a velvet-draped pedestal where a sapphire diadem rested under a glass dome. Its central gem, a deep blue star sapphire, seemed to pulse with an inner fire. The diadem of Empress Theodora, Hargrove said, his voice reverent. 6th century Byzantine, priceless beyond measure. It's secured with a triple lock mechanism and monitored round the clock. Holmes circled the case, his keen eyes darting over every detail, the lock's intricate design, the faint scratches on the glass, the positioning of the guards. He knelt, producing a magnifying glass from his pocket, and examined the floor. A single thread, deep crimson and velvety, caught his attention. He plucked it with tweezers, holding it to the light. Velvet, Watson, not the cheap sort either. And here, he pointed to a smudged footprint near the pedestal, barely visible on the polished marble. A woman's boot, size 6 with a slight wear on the left heel. Our thief has been careless. Watson frowned. Careless or deliberate? Holmes's smile was sharp. Precisely the question. The note, the thread, the footprint, they're breadcrumbs, Watson. Our velvet mask wants us to follow. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. Jasmine, faint but unmistakable. The thief lingered here, perhaps longer than necessary. They admire their target. Hargrove, pale and fidgeting, interjected, but the diadem is still here. Surely this is a prank. Holmes's gaze darkened. A prank does not leave such precise clues. The velvet mask will strike tonight, Mr. Hargrove. I suggest you double your guards, but Watson and I will handle the rest. Discretion is paramount. That evening, Holmes and Watson returned under cover of darkness, positioning themselves in the shadows of the museum's east wing. Holmes had devised a plan. They would wait, concealed behind a marble statue of Athena, observing the diadem's case. Watson's revolver was at the ready, though Holmes had insisted on subtlety. We are not here to apprehend immediately. Watson, observation first. The mask's methods will reveal their mind. The hours crept by, the museum's silence save for the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant tread of a guard's boots. Watson's eyes grew heavy, but Holmes remained statue-still, his focus unbroken. At precisely 2:17 a.m., a commotion erupted outside, a cacophony of shouts, the crash of glass, and the unmistakable sounds of a brawl. Watson tensed, but Holmes's hand on his arm kept him still. A diversion, Holmes whispered. Stay sharp. Through the gloom, a figure emerged near the diadem's case. Clad in a black cloak, their face obscured by a velvet mask adorned with a silver crescent, they moved with feline grace. The figure produced a small tool, and within seconds, the glass dome's lock clicked open. Watson's breath caught, but Holmes's eyes gleamed with fascination. The figure lifted the diadem, their gloved hands steady, and slipped it into a concealed pouch. As they turned to leave, the velvet mask caught the light, its crescent glinting like a taunt. Now, Watson. Holmes hissed, but the brawl outside crescendoed, drawing the guards' attention. The figure vanished into the shadows, leaving only the empty case and a single object on the pedestal, the velvet mask, its silver crescent mocking their failure. Watson cursed under his breath, but Holmes was already at the case, his magnifying glass in hand. No time for frustration, Watson. The mask has given us a gift. He examined the mask, noting its fine stitching and the faint trace of jasmine lingering on the fabric. This is no ordinary velvet. It's imported, likely Venetian, and the embroidery is the work of a master. Our thief is no mere criminal. They move in elevated circles. Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the mask on his desk, his mind racing. Watson, nursing a cup of tea, watched as Holmes cross-referenced his notes with a stack of monographs on textiles and criminology. The craftsmanship suggests wealth, Watson. The jasmine scent, the woman's footprint, the violet ink, all point to a culprit of refinement. And yet they risk everything for a single diadem. Why? Watson ventured. Greed? A collector's obsession? Holmes shook his head. Too simplistic. The note, the mask, the theatrics, these are the actions of someone who craves the game as much as the prize. The diadem is but a piece of a larger puzzle. He paused, his eyes narrowing. There is a gala tomorrow night, hosted by Lady Eleanor Crestwood, a reclusive aristocrat known for her collection of rare gems. Her name has surfaced in connection with several high-profile thefts, though never with proof. She's our next lead. Watson raised an eyebrow. You suspect her? A lady of her standing? I suspect everyone, Watson, until the evidence directs otherwise. Lady Crestwood's gala will be a stage, and we shall play our parts. Prepare your evening attire. We're attending. The following evening, the Crestwood estate glowed like a jewel in the heart of Mayfair. Carriages lined the drive, and the air buzzed with the chatter of London's elite. Holmes, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, moved through the crowd. With ease, his eyes scanning every face. Watson, less comfortable in his formal attire, stayed close, his hand never far from the revolver concealed in his waistband. Lady Eleanor Crestwood was a vision in emerald silk, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. She greeted guests with a practiced smile, but Holmes noted the tension in her posture, the way her eyes darted toward a locked door at the far end of the ballroom. She's nervous, Watson, he murmured. Something weighs on her. As the orchestra played a waltz, Holmes slipped away, motioning for Watson to keep watch. Using a slender lockpick, he entered the locked study, a dimly lit room lined with books and artifacts. A heavy oak desk dominated the space, and behind a portrait of a stern-faced ancestor, Holmes found a concealed safe. His fingers worked swiftly, the safe's tumblers yielding to his expertise. Inside, he found no diadem, but a forged museum pass caught his eye. Its ink matched the violet hue of the velvet mask's note. Before he could investigate further, Lady Eleanor's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" She stood in the doorway, her face pale but composed. "You're as bold as they say." Holmes closed the safe, unfazed. "And you, Lady Crestwood, are entangled in something dangerous. This pass suggests a connection to the museum theft. Care to explain?" Her composure faltered, her hands twisting together. "I am no thief, Mr. Holmes. I'm a victim. The velvet mask has been blackmailing me for months, threatening to expose a scandal from my past, a youthful indiscretion, nothing more. They demanded I provide access to the museum, or they'd ruin me." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the diadem?" "I know nothing of it," she insisted, her voice trembling. "They left a note in that safe instructing me to stay silent. I swear, I've never seen their face." Holmes retrieved the note, a single sheet written in the now familiar violet ink. It read, "The shadows meet at the docks, midnight, the third pier. Speak and lose all." He folded it carefully, his mind already racing. "You've been unwise, Lady Crestwood, but not irredeemable. Stay here and say nothing. Watson and I will handle the rest." As they left the gala, Watson's brow furrowed. "You believe her, Holmes? She could be playing us." Holmes's lips curled into a wry smile. "She's frightened, Watson, and fear is a poor mask for deception. The docks are our next stage. The velvet mask is orchestrating a larger game, and we must be ready for their next act." The night was young, but the fog seemed to thicken as if London itself conspired to shield the velvet mask's secrets. Holmes and Watson hailed a cab, their destination the shadowy docks, where the Thames whispered its own mysteries. The game was afoot, and Holmes's pulse quickened with the thrill of the chase. The docks were a labyrinth of crates and creaking ships, the air heavy with salt and tar. Holmes and Watson moved silently, their footsteps muffled by the fog. At the third pier, they spotted two figures cloaked in darkness, their voices low. One wore the unmistakable velvet mask, its silver crescent catching the moonlight. Holmes signaled Watson to stay low, his eyes locked on the exchange. The masked figure handed a small package to their companion, who slipped it into a satchel. Before Holmes could act, a creak from a nearby crate betrayed their presence. The velvet mask whirled, their cloak billowing, and vanished into the maze of cargo. Watson gave chase, but Holmes stayed, retrieving a dropped ledger from the ground. Its pages were filled with cryptic entries, dates, artifacts, and sums of money, all linked to an underground auction known as the Raven's Vault. Back at Baker Street, Holmes pored over the ledger, his pipe sending curls of smoke into the air. The velvet mask is no lone operator, Watson. This ledger suggests a network, a syndicate dealing in stolen artifacts. The Raven's Vault is there. Marketplace, hidden somewhere in London's underbelly. We must infiltrate it. Watson leaned forward, his eyes alight with determination. How? We don't know where it is. Holmes tapped the ledger, a particular phrase catching his eye. Beneath the raven's wings, the vault opens at dusk. A. Code, Watson. The Raven's Vault is a place, likely a warehouse or cellar, and dusk suggests a time. We'll need disguises wealthy collectors, perhaps, with a taste for the illicit. The mask will be there, and so will the diadem. As dawn broke, Holmes and Watson prepared their plan, crafting false identities and securing forged invitations to the auction. The velvet mask had outmaneuvered them once, but Holmes's mind was a steel trap, closing tighter with every clue. The game was far from over, and the diadem's disappearance was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Gala's Hidden Truths. The gas lamps of Mayfair flickered like uncertain stars, casting long shadows across the cobblestones as Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson stepped from their hansom cab. The air was thick with the scent of rain and the distant hum of London's nightlife, but their focus was singular. Lady Eleanor Crestwood's gala, a glittering affair at her palatial residence, where the city's elite gathered under the guise of charity. Holmes, dressed in a tailored black suit that accentuated his lean frame, adjusted his cufflinks with a precision that belied the storm of calculations in his mind. Watson, ever the steadfast companion, smoothed his mustache and tugged at his collar, uncomfortable in the starched formality of his attire. "Really, Holmes," Watson muttered, eyeing the throng of carriages lining the street, "this feels more like a stage than a soiree. Are you certain Lady Eleanor is our lead?" Holmes's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Certainty, Watson, is a luxury we seldom afford. But the velvet mask's craftsmanship, its silver crescent, the quality of the thread, points to wealth and access. Lady Eleanor, with her penchant for rare gems and her reclusive nature, is a thread worth pulling." They ascended the marble steps of Crestwood House, its facade aglow with the warm light spilling from towering windows. The butler, a severe man with a face like weathered oak, took their names with a curt nod and ushered them into a grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen cascades, their light refracting across polished floors and the silken gowns of London's aristocracy. Laughter and the clink of champagne flutes filled the air, underpinned by the delicate strains of a string quartet. Holmes's eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the room. He noted the posture of every guest, the flicker of their glances, the subtle shifts in their weight. To the untrained eye, it was a scene of opulence and ease, but to Holmes, it was a chessboard, each piece moving with intent. Watson, less attuned to such subtleties, leaned closer. "What are we looking for, exactly?" "Tell, Watson," Holmes replied, his voice low. "The velvet mask is no common thief. Their work at the museum was precise, audacious. They thrive on control, yet they leave clues deliberate or not. Watch for hesitation, for guarded glances, for anyone who seems misplaced." As they mingled, Holmes's presence drew curious looks. His reputation preceded him, and whispers followed in his wake. Watson, ever the social buffer, exchanged pleasantries with a portly earl who droned on about fox hunting, allowing Holmes to slip through the crowd like a shadow. His attention settled on Lady Eleanor Crestwood, who stood near a marble fireplace, her auburn hair catching the firelight. She was striking, her emerald gown accentuating her poised elegance, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. She glanced repeatedly toward a corridor branching from the ballroom, where a heavy oak door stood closed. Holmes nudged Watson, tilting his head subtly toward the corridor. "That door, Watson." "It's locked, I wager, and Lady Eleanor's interest in it is far from casual. Keep her occupied." Watson nodded, adjusting his stance to exude the affable charm that came so naturally to him. He approached Lady Eleanor, offering a warm smile. "Lady Crestwood, your gala is the talk of London. Might I trouble you for a moment's conversation about your charitable endeavors?" As Watson engaged her, Holmes slipped away, moving with the grace of a cat burglar. The corridor was dimly lit, its walls adorned with portraits of stern-faced Crestwood ancestors. The oak door, as he suspected, was locked, but its mechanism was no match for his deft fingers and his slender lockpick concealed in his watch chain. Within moments the lock clicked, and he eased the door open, stepping into a study that smelled of leather and old books. The room was a sanctuary of wealth. Mahogany shelves lined with first editions, a crystal decanter glinting on a sideboard, and a massive desk cluttered with papers. Holmes's eyes darted to a painting above the fireplace, a door nobleman in a powdered wig. Its frame was slightly askew, a detail most would overlook. He pressed along its edges, and with a soft click, the painting swung outward, revealing a small safe embedded in the wall. Holmes's fingers worked swiftly, his ear pressed to the safe as he turned the dial, listening for the telltale clicks of the tumblers. The safe opened with a satisfying clunk, revealing a slim stack of documents. Among them was a forged museum pass, its ink still fresh, and a velvet pouch containing a single pearl earring and odd item for a safe. There was no sign of the sapphire diadem, but the forged pass confirmed a connection to the museum theft. As he examined the pass, a faint rustle came from behind the door. Holmes froze, his senses sharp. The door creaked open, and Lady Eleanor stood there, her face pale. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "what are you doing in my study?" Holmes closed the safe with a deliberate calm, turning to face her. "Lady Eleanor, I am investigating a matter of great consequence. The sapphire diadem, stolen from the British Museum, has led me here." This forged past suggests you are entangled in the affair. Her eyes widened, and she clutched the doorframe for support. I am not a thief, Mr. Holmes. I swear it. I've been coerced. Holmes's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. Coerced by whom? The Velvet Mask? She nodded, her lips tight. They know things secrets about my family, my late husband's debts. They demanded I provide access to the museum, threatening to ruin me. I had no choice. Holmes stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. What did they ask of you precisely? A key, she whispered. A key to the exhibit hall. I left it in a drop point, as instructed. I never saw their face. And this? Holmes held up the forged pass. I don't know how it got there, she said, her voice breaking. They must have placed it to ensure my silence. Holmes pocketed the pass, his mind racing. Lady Eleanor's fear was genuine, but her story left gaps. He returned to the safe, retrieving a folded sheet tucked beneath the documents. It was a coded message, written in a cipher of numbers and symbols. His fingers traced the lines, his mind already unraveling its pattern. This message, he said. Where did it come from? I found it in my carriage after the museum. Theft, she admitted. I was too frightened to act on it. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. Return to your guests, Lady Eleanor. Say nothing of this. I will handle the matter. She hesitated, then nodded, retreating to the ballroom. Holmes rejoined Watson, who was extricating himself from a conversation about pheasant season. Well, Watson asked, raising an eyebrow. She's a pawn, not a queen, Holmes murmured, slipping the coded message into his pocket. The Velvet Mask is pulling strings, and this, he tapped his pocket, points to a meeting at the docks tomorrow night. We must prepare, Watson. The game is afoot. They left the gala under the pretense of fatigue, but Holmes's mind was alight with possibilities. Back at Baker Street, he spread the coded message on his desk, his violin abandoned in favor of a pencil and paper. The cipher was a substitution code, intricate but not impenetrable. By dawn he had cracked it, revealing a time and place, midnight at St. Catherine Docks, a rendezvous for the Velvet Mask's next move. Watson, bleary-eyed but loyal, watched Holmes work. You're certain this isn't a trap? He asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Of course it's a trap, Watson. But traps are only dangerous if you don't see them coming. The next evening, as London's fog thickened, Holmes and Watson prepared for the docks. Holmes donned a rough seaman's coat, his face smudged with soot to blend into the shadows. Watson, similarly disguised, checked his revolver, his expression grim. The coded message had promised answers, but the Velvet Mask's cunning suggested danger. As they stepped into the night, Holmes's mind was a razor, cutting through the fog of uncertainty, ready to unravel the next thread of the enigma. Chapter 4. Shadows on the Thames. The fog hung heavy over London's docks, a thick gray shroud that swallowed the gaslights and muffled the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestone. Sherlock Holmes stood motionless at the edge of a narrow alley, his sharp eyes piercing the mist, his Inverness cape damp with the night's chill. Beside him, Dr. John Watson shifted uneasily, his hand resting on the reassuring weight of his service revolver tucked beneath his coat. The air carried the briny tang of the Thames, mingled with the acrid bite of coal smoke and the faint, sour reek of rotting fish. Somewhere in the gloom, the velvet mask was moving, and Holmes was determined to catch them. The coded message found in Lady Eleanor Crestwood's safe had led them here, to this labyrinth of wharves and warehouses where the city's underbelly thrived. The message, written in a cipher Holmes had cracked in under an hour, had been precise. Midnight, Black Wharf, Third Pier. The Raven's Vault awaits. Holmes had murmured the phrase, the Raven's Vault, repeatedly since deciphering it, as if tasting its implications. Watson, less enamored of riddles, had simply asked, "What's the plan, Holmes?" "Patience, Watson," Holmes had replied, his voice low and steady. "The velvet mask is a fox, cunning and elusive. We must let them come to us." Now, as the distant church bells tolled midnight, the docks were alive with subtle sounds, the creak of moored ships, the slap of water against pilings, the occasional shout of a drunken sailor. Holmes's eyes flicked toward a shadowed pier where a single lantern flickered, its weak light barely cutting through the fog. "There," he whispered, gesturing with a gloved hand. Watson squinted, catching the faint outline of two figures moving near a stack of crates, their silhouettes distorted by the mist. Holmes led the way, moving with the silent grace of a cat, his boots making no sound on the slick cobblestones. Watson followed, his heart pounding, though he kept his steps measured to avoid betraying their presence. The figures ahead were engaged in a hushed exchange, their words lost to the fog, but their gestures urgent. One was cloaked, their face obscured by a hood, the velvet mask, Watson was certain. The other, shorter and broader, carried a small crate, which he set down with a thud. Holmes paused behind a rusted iron bollard, his eyes narrowing as he studied the scene. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The crate is too small for the diadem, but its weight suggests something valuable. Likely a precursor to the larger skein." Watson nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. The velvet mask had outwitted them at the museum, and the memory of that failure stung. The cloaked figure gestured sharply, and the second man opened the crate, revealing a glint of metal within, perhaps coins or small artifacts. Holmes's lips curled into a faint smile. "A transaction," he said softly. "The mask is not merely a thief, but a broker in stolen goods. This is no solitary criminal, Watson. We are dealing with a network." Before Watson could respond, a sudden noise, a sharp crack, like a plank snapping, echoed from the pier. The cloaked figures spun, their hoods slipping slightly to reveal a flash of pale skin before they pulled it back. The second man froze, then bolted into the fog, leaving the crate behind. The velvet mask hesitated, then darted toward a narrow gangway leading to a moored skiff. After them, Holmes hissed, breaking into a sprint. Watson followed, his boots slipping on the wet stones as they pursued the fleeing figure. The fog seemed to thicken with each step, swallowing the mask's silhouette until only the faint splash of oars betrayed their escape. Holmes skidded to a halt at the gangway's edge, his breath visible in the cold air. The skiff was already vanishing into the mist, its occupant rowing with swift, practiced strokes. "Blast it," Watson muttered, gripping his revolver tighter. "They're gone." "Not entirely," Holmes said, crouching to examine the gangway. His fingers brushed over a damp board, then plucked something from a crack, a small, folded piece of paper. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the contents. "A ledger page," he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "Dates, amounts, and a single phrase. The Raven's Vault. Lot 17. Watson peered over his shoulder, but the cramped handwriting was nearly illegible in the dim light. "What does it mean, Holmes?" "It means," Holmes said, rising, "that the velvet mask is not merely stealing for profit, but supplying an underground market. The Raven's Vault is no myth. It's a venue, a secret auction for stolen artifacts. And Lot 17 is likely our diadem." He tucked the paper into his pocket, his expression hardening. "We must find this auction, Watson. It's the key to unmasking our quarry." They retraced their steps to the abandoned crate, which Holmes inspected with meticulous care. Inside were a handful of gold coins stamped with a foreign crest and a small, intricately carved ivory statuette. "Ottoman, 16th century," Holmes noted, turning the statuette in his hands. "Valuable, but not the mask's primary target. These are crumbs, Watson, meant to distract from the larger prize." The rest of the night was spent combing the docks for further clues, but the fog and the labyrinthine layout of the wharves yielded little. By dawn, Holmes and Watson returned to Baker Street, the ledger page their only tangible gain. Holmes spread it out on his desk, his magnifying glass hovering over the cryptic entries. "The Raven's Vault," he murmured again, as if the words held a secret rhythm. "It's a place, Watson, but hidden. Likely in one of London's underbelly's Whitechapel, perhaps, or the East End." Watson, nursing a cup of tea toward off the morning chill, frowned. "How do we find it? The docks are a warren, and the mask knows we're after them now." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "We don't find it, Watson. We let it find us. The ledger mentions a date tomorrow night. We shall attend this auction, not as hunters, but as prey-wealthy collectors with a taste for the illicit. The velvet mask will be there, and so will the diadem." The next day was a blur of preparation. Holmes, with his uncanny knack for disguise, transformed himself into Mr. Archibald Vance, a portly antiquarian with a waxed mustache and a penchant for gaudy waistcoats. Watson, less convincingly, became Dr. Clarence Mortimer, a retired surgeon with a limp and a monocle. Holmes coached him on the finer points of their cover story. They were partners in a private collection, seeking rare gems to complete their hoard. Watson grumbled about the monocle but complied, trusting Holmes's instincts. The address on the ledger led them to a derelict warehouse in Shadwell, its windows boarded and its walls stained with soot. A burly man at the door demanded a password, which Holmes supplied without hesitation. "Corvus," Latin for raven. The man nodded, ushering them into a dimly lit interior where a crowd of shadowed figures milled about, their faces half hidden by hats or scarves. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the murmur of guarded conversation. Holmes's eyes darted across the room, cataloging details: the armed guards at the exits, the velvet-draped table at the center, the nervous energy of the bidders. "Stay close, Watson," he whispered. "The mask is here watching." The auction began with a gaunt auctioneer, his voice sharp as a blade, presenting a series of stolen artifacts: a jade idol from India, a silver chalice from a sacked monastery, a necklace of blackened pearls. Watson's stomach churned at the casual trade in stolen history, but Holmes's face remained impassive, his hand occasionally rising to bid on minor items to maintain their cover. Then came Lot 17. The auctioneer unveiled a velvet cushion, and there it was, the sapphire diadem, its gems catching the lantern light like stars in a midnight sky. Watson's breath caught, but Holmes's hand on his arm kept him steady. "Not yet," Holmes murmured. The bidding was fierce, with voices calling out sums that made Watson's head spin. Holmes bid sparingly, enough to stay in the game, but not to draw attention. The velvet mask appeared at the table's edge, their cloaked form commanding silence. Watson strained to see their face, but the hood and a delicate velvet mask obscured all but their eyes, which glinted with cold intelligence. The mask raised a hand, and the auctioneer announced the diadem sold to an unseen bidder in a private box above. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Holmes's jaw tightened. "Now, Watson," he said, his voice barely audible. He slipped a small vial from his pocket, tossing it into a nearby brazier. The vial shattered, releasing a cloud of choking smoke. Shouts erupted, and the crowd surged toward the exits. Holmes and Watson moved against the tide, heading for the private box. The velvet mask was already gone, but Holmes spotted a glint on the floor, a ring, dropped in the chaos, its band engraved with a crescent moon. They escaped the warehouse as the smoke cleared, the ring clutched in Holmes's hand. Back at Baker Street, he examined it under a lamp, his fingers tracing the engraving. "This is no ordinary trinket," he said. "The crescent moon matches the embroidery on the mask, and the craftsmanship. Look at the precision. This was made by Marcus Vane, a jeweler in Whitechapel with a reputation for discretion." Watson leaned forward, exhaustion warring with excitement. "Then we confront Vane?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes alight. "The velvet mask is clever, but they've left a thread for us to pull. Tomorrow we visit Vane's shop. But be wary. Watson the mask knows we're close, and they will not hesitate to strike." As the fire crackled in the hearth, Holmes leaned back in his chair, the ring glinting in his hand. The chase was far from over, but for the first time he felt the velvet mask's shadow within reach. The Raven's Vault had revealed its secrets, and Sherlock Holmes was ready to unravel them. Chapter 5. The Raven's Vault. Fog hung heavy over London, a thick, grey shroud that clung to the cobblestones and muffled the clatter of hooves and wheels. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson moved swiftly through the labyrinthine alleys of the East End, their footsteps echoing faintly against the damp walls. The night was alive with the low hum of the city-distant shouts, the creak of a cart, the occasional bark of a stray dog, but to Holmes it was all mere background noise, irrelevant to the task at hand. His mind was a razor, slicing through the chaos, focused on the cryptic lead they'd uncovered. The Raven's Vault, a name that promised answers but offered only shadows. Holmes had donned a disguise for the evening, transforming himself into a wealthy collector named Mr. Archibald Vance. His sharp features were softened by a false beard, his piercing gray eyes hidden behind tinted spectacles, and his usual lean silhouette padded to suggest a man of leisure and excess. Watson, less comfortable in deception, wore the garb of a merchant, his broad shoulders squared beneath a heavy overcoat, his mustache trimmed to a more severe line to match his assumed identity as Mr. Henry Caldwell. They carried forged invitations to an underground auction, secured through Holmes's network of informants, each invitation bearing a wax seal stamped with a raven's silhouette. The warehouse loomed ahead, a derelict hulk squatting on the edge of the Thames. Its windows were boarded, its brick walls stained with soot and time, but faint light flickered through the cracks, betraying activity within. Holmes paused at the corner of a narrow street, his hand raised to halt Watson. "Observe," he whispered, gesturing toward a shadowed figure guarding the entrance. A burly man with a scarred face and a cudgel at his belt. "Our welcome committee." Note the tension in his posture. He's not merely a hired thug. He's expecting trouble. Watson nodded, his hand brushing the revolver concealed beneath his coat. "Do we take him now?" Holmes's lips twitched. In a faint smile, "Patience, Watson. Brute force is seldom the answer when finesse will suffice." He adjusted his spectacles and stepped forward, his gait shifting to the confident swagger of Archibald Vance. "Good evening, my man," he called, his voice carrying a practiced drawl. "I believe we're expected." The guard's eyes narrowed, but he took the proffered invitation, scrutinizing it under the dim glow of a lantern. After a moment, he grunted and jerked his head toward the door. "Inside, don't wander." The interior of the warehouse was a stark contrast to its dilapidated exterior. The vast space had been transformed into a clandestine bazaar, lit by gas lamps that cast a warm, deceptive glow over the scene. Long tables lined the walls, draped in black velvet and laden with artifact statuettes, jeweled daggers, ancient manuscripts, and relics of dubious provenance. The air was thick with the scent of cigar smoke, perfume, and the faint tang of river water. Men and women in fine attire mingled, their faces masked to conceal their identities, their voices low and guarded. This was no ordinary auction. It was a den of thieves and collectors, where stolen treasures changed hands under the guise of civility. Holmes moved through the crowd with ease, his eyes scanning every detail: the glint of a gold watch, the cut of a tailored coat, the nervous fidgeting of a bidder clutching a catalogue. Watson followed, his discomfort evident in the tight set of his jaw, but he played his role well, nodding politely to passers-by while keeping Holmes in his peripheral vision. They approached a central platform where a gaunt auctioneer, his face half hidden by a silk mask, was preparing to begin. Above him hung a banner emblazoned with a raven, its wings spread wide, its eyes rendered in crimson thread. "The Raven's Vault," Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible. "A fitting name for a den of scavengers. Stay close, Watson, and keep your wits about you. The velvet mask is here. I can feel it." The auction began with a flourish, the auctioneer's voice cutting through the murmurs. "Ladies and gentlemen, we open with Lot 1, a Sumerian amulet, circa 2000 BC, rumored to grant its wearer protection from the god's wrath. Shall we start at £500? Bids flew fast, hands raising discreetly, masked faces betraying no emotion. Holmes watched, his mind cataloguing each bidder's mannerisms. A woman in a peacock feather mask bid aggressively on a jade figurine, her gloved hands trembling slightly. A man with a gold-tipped cane hesitated before raising his paddle for a Byzantine chalice. Every gesture, every pause, was a clue, and Holmes absorbed them all. Then came the moment they'd been waiting for. The auctioneer lifted a velvet cloth to reveal the sapphire diadem, its facets catching the lamplight in a dazzling display. The crowd gasped, and even Watson, hardened by years of adventure, let out a low whistle. "Magnificent," he muttered. "Indeed." Holmes replied, his tone dry. "And stolen not 3 nights ago. Watch closely, Watson. The velvet mask will not resist this prize." The bidding began at £1,000, climbing rapidly. Holmes raised his paddle once, twice, keeping Archibald Vance's persona intact, but his eyes were on the crowd. A figure near the back, cloaked in black, caught his attention. The bidders' movements were fluid, deliberate, and their mask velvet, embroidered with a silver crescent, matched the one left at the museum. Holmes's pulse quickened, though his face remained impassive. 1,500, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 16? The cloaked figure raised a hand and Holmes noted a glint of metal or ring, its design distinctive, a serpent coiled around an emerald. It was a fleeting glimpse, but enough. Holmes leaned toward Watson. Mark that ring, Watson. It's our key. The bidding escalated, reaching £2,000. Holmes bid again, pushing the price higher, hoping to unsettle the velvet mask. The cloaked figure countered without hesitation, their posture calm but resolute. The room buzzed with tension, the other bidders falling silent as the duel narrowed to Holmes and his quarry. 3,000. Holmes called, his voice ringing. Out, the crowd stirred, and the velvet mask paused, their head tilting slightly as if sizing him up. Then, with a slow, deliberate gesture, they raised their hand again. 3,500. The auctioneer shouted. Do I hear 4? Holmes hesitated, calculating. To bid further risked drawing too much attention, but to withdraw Mal might lose the diadem and the mask. He glanced at Watson, who gave a subtle nod, trusting his friend's instincts. 4,000, Holmes said, his tone steady. The velvet mask countered immediately. 4,500. The room was silent now, all eyes on the two bidders. Holmes felt the weight of the moment, the thrill of the chase sharpening. His senses, he raised his paddle one final time. 5,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The velvet mask hesitated, their hand hovering, then lowered it. The auctioneer banged his gavel. Sold to the gentleman in the grey coat. For £5,000. Holmes allowed himself a small smile, but his eyes never left the cloaked figure. The velvet mask rose, moving toward the back of the room, where a curtained exit awaited. Holmes whispered to Watson, "Follow me, but stay discreet. We cannot lose them now." They wove through the crowd, dodging masked figures and sidestepping a waiter with a tray of champagne. The velvet mask slipped behind the curtain, and Holmes quickened his pace, his hand slipping into his pocket to grip a small vial of pepper powder, a precaution for emergencies. The curtain led to a narrow corridor, dimly lit, with crates stacked haphazardly along the walls. At the far end, a door swung shut. Holmes reached the door first, easing it open to reveal a loading dock overlooking the Thames. The fog was thicker here, swirling like a living thing, and the velvet mask was nowhere in sight. Watson cursed under his breath. They've vanished again. Not quite, Holmes said, crouching to examine the ground. His fingers brushed. A faint scuff mark on the wooden planks, leading to a pile of crates. He moved silently, signaling Watson to cover the other side. As they approached, a shadow darted from behind the crates, the velvet mask's cloak billowing as they sprinted. Toward a waiting boat, Holmes sprang forward, his disguise forgotten, his long legs closing the distance. The mask reached the boat, leaping aboard as the engine roared to life. Watson shouted, drawing his revolver, but Holmes waved him off. "No shots, Watson. We need them alive." The boat began to pull away, but Holmes was already calculating. He seized the coil of rope from the dock, looping it around a post with practiced precision. With a powerful heave, he tossed the other end toward the boat, the rope catching on a cleat. The boat jerked, its engine straining, and for a moment it seemed the mask might escape. But the rope held, and Holmes pulled, dragging the boat back toward the dock. The velvet mask turned, their face obscured, but their posture radiating fury. They drew a knife, its blade glinting in the moonlight, and slashed at the rope. Holmes lunged, tackling the figure as the boat rocked violently. They grappled, the mask's strength surprising, their movements precise. Holmes felt the sting of the knife graze his arm, but he twisted, pinning the mask's wrist. The ring glinted again, and Holmes seized the moment, wrenching it free as the mask broke away, diving into the river with a splash. Watson reached the dock, panting. "Holmes, are you hurt?" "A scratch," Holmes replied, holding up the ring. "But we have this." "And that, Watson, is worth more than the diadem itself." They returned to Baker Street under the cover of dawn, the city stirring to life around them. In the quiet of their sitting room, Holmes examined the ring under a magnifying glass. Its craftsmanship was exquisite, the serpent scales etched with meticulous detail, the emerald cut to perfection. "This is no trinket," he said, turning it in the light. "It was made by a master, and I know just the man." Watson frowned, nursing a cup of tea. "Who?" "Marcus Vane," Holmes said, his voice low. "A jeweler in Whitechapel, disgraced after a scandal involving forged gems. His work is unmistakable. This ring ties him to the velvet mask, and I suspect he knows more than he'll admit." Holmes rose, his energy undimmed despite the night's exertions. "We'll pay Mr. Vane a visit tomorrow. For now, rest, Watson. The game is afoot, and we are closer than ever to unmasking our quarry." Watson nodded, though his expression was grim. "You think the mask planned for us to take the ring?" Holmes's eyes gleamed. "I think the mask is playing a deeper game than we yet understand. But every move they make reveals a little more. And I, Watson, am a very patient man." The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, the fog began to lift, revealing the first rays of morning. Holmes settled into his chair, the ring glinting in his hand, his mind already racing toward the next step in the chase. The next day. London was a blur of activity, but Holmes and Watson moved with purpose, their destination a narrow street in Whitechapel, where Marcus Vane's shop stood. The jeweler's storefront was unassuming, its sign faded, its windows smudged with grime. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polish and metal, and shelves lined with tools and half-finished pieces spoke of a craftsman's life interrupted. Vane was a wiry man, his hair thinning, his eyes darting nervously as Holmes and Watson entered. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice tinged with unease, "what can I do for you?" Holmes wasted no time, producing the ring and placing it on the counter. "You made this, Mr. Vane. I'd like to know for whom." Vane's face paled, his hands trembling as he reached for the ring, then drew back. I make many pieces." "I don't recall." "Don't lie to me," Holmes said, his voice like steel. "This ring was worn by the Velvet Mask, a thief, who's been outwitting half of London. You will tell me what you know, or I'll ensure Scotland Yard takes an interest in your affairs." Vane swallowed hard, his eyes flicking toward the door. Watson stepped subtly to block it, his presence a quiet threat. After a long pause, Vane spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I made the ring, yes, but I never met the client. They sent instructions by letter detailed, precise. Wanted a serpent design, emerald in the center. Paid in cash, left in a lockbox at the docks." Holmes leaned closer, his gaze unyielding. "And the velvet masks? You made those too, didn't you?" Vane's shoulders slumped. "Yes, 3 of them. Black velvet, silver thread. They wanted them perfect, no flaws. I thought it was for a masquerade. Not this. Where are the sketches?" Holmes demanded. "You kept them, didn't you?" Vane hesitated, then moved to a cluttered desk, pulling open a drawer. He produced a bundle of papers, their edges worn, and handed them to Holmes. The sketches were meticulous, showing the diadem's setting, its gems marked with precise measurements. One page caught Holmes's eye, a note in the margin, written in the same elegant script as the letter from Baker Street. It read, "Second target, Emerald Scepter, Holt Manor." Holmes's pulse quickened. "The Emerald Scepter," he said, almost to himself. "Another prize for the mask. Where is it now?" Vane shook his head. "I don't know. I swear it. I just made what they asked." Holmes pocketed the sketches, his mind already racing. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Vane, but if I find you've withheld anything, I'll be back." As they stepped into the street, Watson glanced at Holmes. "The Emerald Scepter, Sir Reginald Holt's collection, isn't it?" "Precisely," Holmes said, his pace quickening. "Holt is a recluse, paranoid about his treasures. If the velvet mask is targeting the scepter, they'll need to breach a fortress. We must get there first." The journey to Holt Manor was a study in contrasts, London's bustle giving way to the quiet lanes of the countryside, where the air was crisp and the horizon wide. The manor itself was a looming edifice of stone, its walls fortified, its windows barred. Sir Reginald Holt, a wiry man with a hawkish face, greeted them with suspicion, but Holmes's credentials as a historian forged, of course, gained them entry. The manor's interior was a maze of locked doors and hidden passages, each room a shrine to Holt's obsession with artifacts. The emerald scepter rested in a glass case, its green gem glowing under candlelight. Holmes examined the case, noting the intricate locks and pressure plates. "A formidable defense," he murmured. "But the mask has already been here." Watson frowned. "How do you know?" Holmes pointed to a faint scratch on the case, barely visible. "This was made by a diamond-tipped tool, likely last night. The mask tested the defenses but didn't strike. They're planning something bigger." Double quotes Holt, overhearing, scoffed. "No one could breach my security. This manor is impregnable." Holmes's smile was thin. "So was the British Museum, Sir Reginald." That night, Holmes and Watson took up vigil in the manor, hidden in a shadowed alcove overlooking the scepter's chamber. Hours passed, the silence broken only by the ticking of a distant clock. Then a faint click echoed through the room. Holmes tensed, his hand on Watson's arm. A panel in the wall slid open, and a figure emerged, the velvet mask, their cloak blending with the shadows, their movements silent as a cat's. Holmes waited, letting the mask approach the case. They produced a tool, working swiftly to disarm the locks. Just as the case opened, Holmes sprang forward, his voice sharp. "Enough, velvet mask. Step away." The figure froze, then turned, their mask glinting in the dim light. For a moment, Holmes thought they'd surrender. Instead, the mask hurled a small device to the floor, and a cloud of smoke erupted, choking the air. Watson coughed, drawing his revolver, but the mask was already gone. The panel sliding shut behind them. Holmes rushed to the panel, but it was sealed, its mechanism hidden. He cursed softly, then turned to the case. The scepter was still there, but a note lay beside it, written in that familiar script. "You're late, Mr. Holmes. The Cove awaits." Watson read the note, his face grim. "The Smuggler's Cove. They're taunting us." Holmes's eyes burned with determination. "They're testing us, Watson, but every test brings us closer. The Cove is their next move, and we'll be there." The journey to the Smuggler's Cove was fraught with peril, the stormy sea battering their small boat as they approached the rocky shore. The cove was a jagged scar in the coastline, its cliffs looming like sentinels. Holmes and Watson disembarked, their lanterns casting feeble light against the darkness. The smuggling operation was in full swing, crates being loaded onto a waiting ship. And there, at the center, was the Velvet Mask, overseeing the chaos with calm authority. Holmes signaled Watson, and they moved silently, using the rocks for cover. The mask was handing the emerald scepter to a cloaked figure, another buyer, perhaps. Holmes's mind raced, calculating angles, timing. He needed to act, but the mask was too quick, too clever. Then a shout broke the silence. A smuggler spotting them. Chaos erupted, shots ringing out, men scattering. Holmes seized the moment, tackling the mask as they tried to flee. They grappled, the scepter falling to the ground. The mask's knife flashed, but Holmes was faster, twisting their arm until the blade fell. The ring glinted again, and Holmes tore it free, shoving the mask back. The figure vanished into the storm, leaving Holmes holding the ring and the scepter. Watson joined him, panting. "We got it, Holmes." But they escaped again. Holmes's smile was grim. "Not for long, Watson. This ring, these sketches, this note, they're threads in a web. And I'm beginning to see the pattern." Back at Baker Street, Holmes spread the sketches and the note across the table, his mind working furiously. The Velvet Mask was no ordinary thief. Their motives were complex, their methods theatrical. The ring tied them to Vane, the sketches to the scepter, the note to the Cove. But there was something more, something deeper. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice low, "the mask is playing a game of misdirection. The artifacts are a means, not an end. They're exposing someone powerful." Watson frowned. "Who?" Holmes held up the ring, its emerald catching the firelight. "That, my dear Watson, is what we'll find out. But first, we confront Vane again. He knows more than he's told us." The chapter closed with Holmes staring into the fire, the ring in his hand, his mind a storm of possibilities. The Velvet Mask was out there, one step ahead, but Holmes was closing in, and the game was far from over. He turned to the jeweler, who was clutching his chest, his eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Vane, your life is in danger. Speak now, or the next trap may not miss. What else do you know?" Vane's voice was barely a whisper. There was another order. A second artifact. They asked for sketches of the Emerald Scepter, held by Sir Reginald Holt. I sent them last week. That's all I know, I swear. Holmes exchanged a glance with Watson, his mind racing. "The Emerald Scepter," he said, almost to himself. "Another prize for our elusive thief. We must move quickly, Watson. If the mask is targeting the scepter, we have little time." They left Vane in the care of a passing constable summoned by the blaze and made their way back to Baker Street. The night was alive with the clamor of fire bells and shouting voices, but Holmes's focus was absolute. In the quiet of their rooms, he spread the salvaged sketches on the table, his fingers tracing the lines of the diadem's dismantling. "The velvet mask is no ordinary criminal," he said, his voice low and intense. "They are meticulous, ruthless, and always one step ahead." But this explosion was a miscalculation, a sign of desperation. "We are closer than they realize." Watson sank into his chair, his heart still pounding from the narrow escape. "What's our next move, Holmes?" "This scepter, where is it?" "Sir Reginald Holt's manor," Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with determination. "A fortress of a place, rigged with traps of its own, if my sources are correct. We must gain access, and we must do so before the velvet mask strikes again." He rose, his silhouette sharp against the firelight. "Rest now, Watson. Tomorrow we hunt." The chapter drew to a close with the crackle of the fire in the hearth, the weight of the case heavier than ever. Holmes stood at the window, staring into the foggy night, his mind a whirlwind of clues and possibilities. The velvet mask was out there, their identity still shrouded. But Holmes felt the thrill of the chase burning brighter than ever. The game was afoot, and he would not rest until the enigma was unraveled. Chapter 6. The Jeweler's Secret. The gaslit streets of Whitechapel shimmered with a damp sheen, the cobblestones slick from an earlier drizzle that had left the air heavy with the scent of coal and wet earth. Sherlock Holmes, his greatcoat collar turned up against the evening chill, strode purposefully through the labyrinthine alleys, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. Dr. John Watson followed closely, his boots echoing against the uneven stones, his hand resting lightly on the revolver tucked inside his coat. The trail of the velvet mask had led them here to a cluttered, unassuming jeweler's shop tucked between a pawnshop and a tavern that reeked of stale ale. The sign above the door, faded and peeling, read Vane's Fine Gems, its letters barely legible in the flickering light of a nearby street lamp. Holmes paused before the shop, his gaze fixed on the grimy window. A single candle burned inside, casting a weak glow over a display of tarnished rings and chipped cameos. "This is the place, Watson," he murmured, his voice low but laced with the quiet thrill of the hunt. "Marcus Vane, the craftsman of the velvet mask. If my deductions are correct, he holds the key to unraveling our quarry's identity." Watson nodded, his brow furrowed. "You're certain he's involved?" "The man's a jeweler, not a master thief." Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile. "A jeweler with the skill to craft a mask of such exquisite detail is no ordinary tradesman. The silver crescent embroidery we found was no mere ornament, it was a signature. Vane's work is distinctive, and his hands have shaped more than trinkets. Come, let us see what secrets he harbors." The bell above the door gave a feeble jingle as they entered. The shop was a maze of clutter, glass cases crammed with baubles, shelves sagging under the weight of dusty ledgers, and work tables strewn with tools and scraps of velvet. The air smelled of polish and metal, tinged with something acrid, like burnt wax. Behind the counter stood Marcus Vane, a wiry man in his late 40s, his face pale and pinched, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. His fingers, stained with ink and flecked with gold dust, fidgeted with a loop as he looked up, his expression shifting from curiosity to unease. "Mr. Holmes," Vane said, his voice thin and reedy. I wasn't expecting visitors so late. What brings you to my humble shop?" Holmes's eyes gleamed as he stepped forward, his presence filling the cramped space. "We are here, Mr. Vane, to discuss your artistry. Specifically, a certain velvet mask adorned with a silver crescent. A piece so finely crafted, it could only come from hands as skilled as yours." Vane's fingers tightened around the loop, and a bead of sweat glistened on his brow. "I don't know what you mean," he stammered. "I make jewelry rings, necklaces, the usual fare. Masks? That's not my trade." Holmes tilted his head, his gaze piercing. "Come now, Mr. Vane. False modesty ill suits a man of your talent." The mask we found at the British Museum was no amateur's work. The stitching, the choice of materials, the precision of the crescent, it all points to you. Shall we dispense with denials and speak plainly? Watson watched as Vane's composure began to crack, his eyes darting toward a curtained doorway at the back of the shop. "He's hiding something," Watson whispered to Holmes, who gave a slight nod without breaking eye contact with the jeweler. "I've done nothing wrong." Vane protested, his voice rising. "I run a respectable business." "You've no right to accuse me." "Accuse?" Holmes interrupted, his tone deceptively mild. "I merely seek information. A client of yours, perhaps. Someone who commissioned a mask of singular design. A name, Mr. Vane, and we shall trouble you no further." Vane's hands trembled, and he set the loop down with a clatter. "I don't know any names," he said, almost too quickly. "I make what I'm paid to make. Orders come through intermediaries' notes, payments in cash. I don't ask questions." Holmes stepped closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "And yet you crafted a mask that has become the calling card of a thief who has outwitted half of London. Surely you must have some inkling of who they are. Or perhaps," he added, his eyes narrowing, "you are more deeply entangled than you claim." Vane's face drained of what little color it had. "I swear, I don't know. I made the masks, yes, I admit that. But I never met the client." The instructions came by post, with precise measurements and materials. Velvet, silver thread, nothing more. I was paid handsomely, and I did my work, that's all. Holmes's expression remained impassive, but Watson could sense the gears turning in his friend's mind. "Show me," Holmes said abruptly. "Your workspace, your tools, your records. If you are as innocent as you claim, you'll have nothing to hide." Vane hesitated, his gaze flickering again to the curtained doorway. Then, with a resigned sigh, he nodded. "Very well. Follow me." He led them through the curtain into a cramped back room that served as his workshop. The space was even more chaotic than the front. Workbenches were littered with pliers, hammers, and spools of thread. A small furnace glowed in one corner, its heat making the air stifling. Shelves held jars of beads, coils of wire, and scraps of fabric, including a pile of black velvet that caught Holmes's eye. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, picking up a scrap and examining it under the light of a hanging lamp. "The same weave as the mask. You keep a ready supply, I see." Vane shifted uncomfortably. "It's common enough material." I use it for display cushions, linings, and masks," Holmes finished, his tone cutting. He moved to a cluttered desk, his fingers brushing over a stack of papers. "Your records, Mr. Vane. Where are they?" Vane gestured weakly to a ledger on the desk. "There, but it's just account sales, supplies, nothing out of the ordinary." Holmes opened the ledger, his eyes scanning the entries with lightning speed. Watson peered over his shoulder, noting the meticulous handwriting. Dates, item descriptions, payments. Most were mundane: rings resized, brooch repaired, but one entry caught Holmes's attention. He tapped a line dated 2 weeks prior. "Custom commission, velvet mask, silver thread, £50. £50, Holmes said, raising an eyebrow. A princely sum for a single mask, and no client name recorded. Curious, wouldn't you say, Watson? Highly irregular, Watson agreed, glancing at Vane, who was now visibly sweating. Most craftsmen would note the buyer, especially for such a sum. Vane wrung his hands. I told you it was anonymous. The money came with the order. Delivered by a courier. I didn't see their face. Holmes closed the ledger with a snap. Then let us search for something more tangible. Watson, keep an eye on our friend here. I suspect there's more to this shop than meets the eye. As Watson stood guard, Holmes began a methodical search, his movements swift and precise. He tapped walls, lifted floorboards, and examined the undersides of tables. His fingers paused on a small cabinet tucked beneath a workbench, its lock scratched as if recently tampered with. Aha, he said softly, producing a thin metal pick. From his pocket. With a deft twist, the lock clicked open. Inside was a bundle of paper sketches, to be precise. Holmes spread them out on the workbench, revealing detailed drawings of a sapphire diadem, its facets meticulously rendered. Each sketch showed the diadem from a different angle, with notes on its setting and structure. One drawing, however, stood out. It depicted the diadem dismantled, its gems separated from their gold frame. Watson let out a low whistle. They're planning to break it apart. Sell the stones separately, perhaps. Precisely, Holmes said, his eyes alight. The diadem's value lies in its historical significance, but its gems are worth a fortune on the black market. Our velvet mask is not merely a thief, but a strategist, dismantling their prizes to evade detection. He turned to Vane, who had backed against the wall, his face ashen. You made these sketches, didn't you? At whose behest? Vane shook his head frantically. I only drew what I was told. The instructions came with the mask order detailed, specific. They wanted to know how the diadem could be taken apart without damaging the stones. I did it for the money, nothing more. Holmes's gaze was unrelenting. And who paid you, Mr. Vane? A name, a description, anything. I don't know, Vane cried, his voice breaking. The notes were unsigned, the courier a stranger. I swear I'm no criminal. His words were cut off by a sudden deafening boom. The room shook, dust raining from the ceiling as the air filled with the acrid stench of gunpowder. Watson instinctively grabbed Vane, pulling him to the floor as shelves toppled and glass shattered. Holmes, already moving, shielded his face from falling debris, his eyes scanning the chaos. An explosion! Watson shouted, coughing through the smoke. The shop's rigged. Holmes's voice cut through the haze, calm but urgent. The back door, Watson, now! They dragged Vane to his feet, stumbling through the smoke toward a narrow door at the rear of the workshop. The heat was intense, flames licking at the walls as the fire spread with alarming speed. Holmes kicked the door open, revealing a dark alley beyond. They tumbled out, gasping for air, as the shop behind them erupted in a roar of flames. Watson steadied Vane, who was trembling uncontrollably. "Good Lord, Holmes, that was no accident. A trap set for us." Holmes's face was grim, his eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "The velvet mask," he said softly. "They knew we were closing in. This was meant to silence Vane and us." Chapter 7. The scepter's guardian, the fog, clung to London like a jealous lover, its tendrils wrapping around the gas lamps, muting their feeble glow. Sherlock Holmes sat in the hansom cab, his sharp eyes fixed on the passing shadows of Baker Street, his mind already dissecting the puzzle of the velvet mask. Beside him, Dr. John Watson adjusted his scarf, the chill of the late autumn evening seeping through the cab's thin walls. The rhythmic clop of the horses' hooves punctuated the silence, a metronome to Holmes's racing thoughts. "Holmes," Watson ventured, breaking the quiet, "you're certain this emerald scepter is the mask's next target? The diadem was a bold theft, but this feels reckless, even for them." Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile, though his gaze remained distant. "Reckless, Watson?" "No, calculated. The velvet mask thrives on audacity, but it is underpinned by precision. The ledger from the docks pointed to the scepter, and the scepter is held by Sir Reginald Holt, a man whose paranoia rivals his wealth. If the mask seeks it, they've already accounted for his defenses." Watson frowned, his practical mind grappling with the implications. "And Holt's manor rigged with traps, you say? Sounds like a fortress. How do you propose we even get inside?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with that familiar spark of anticipation. "By becoming precisely what Holt expects historians with a passion for antiquities. He's vain enough to entertain such visitors, and I've prepared credentials that will withstand scrutiny. Once inside, we observe, deduce, and, if necessary, disarm whatever obstacles stand in our way." The cab rattled to a stop before a modest inn, where Holmes had arranged for a change of attire. Within minutes, they emerged transformed Holmes. In a tweed suit with a scholar's stoop, his sharp features softened by a pair of spectacles, and Watson in a slightly rumpled jacket, playing the part of a diligent but unremarkable assistant. Their forged letters of introduction, bearing the seal of a fictitious archaeological society, rested in Holmes's pocket. The journey to Holt's Manor, situated on the outskirts of London, took them through winding lanes and past skeletal trees, stripped bare by the season. The manor itself loomed like a Gothic spectre, its turrets piercing the fog, its windows dark save for a few flickering lights. Iron gates, flanked by stone lions, barred the entrance, and a burly groundskeeper scrutinized their papers before waving them through. "Mind your step," the groundskeeper muttered, his voice rough as gravel. "Sir Reginald don't take kindly to uninvited guests." Holmes inclined his head, adopting the mild demeanor of his historian persona. "We are most grateful for Sir Reginald's hospitality. Our interest lies solely in his remarkable collection." The groundskeeper grunted, unconvinced, but led them to the manor's heavy oak doors. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and old leather. A butler, stiff as a marionette, escorted them to a cavernous study where Sir Reginald Holt awaited. Holt was a man of imposing presence, his broad shoulders straining against a velvet smoking jacket, his eyes like chips of flint beneath heavy brows. His mustache twitched as he surveyed his visitors, his suspicion palpable. "Dr. Clarence and Mr. Winton, is it?" he said, glancing at their forged letters. "The Archaeological Society of Wessex." "Never heard of it." Holmes, as Dr. Clarence, offered a disarming smile. "A small but dedicated group, Sir Reginald. We specialize in pre-Roman artifacts, and your emerald scepter is said to be unparalleled. Might we view it?" Holt's eyes narrowed, but his vanity won out. "Very well, but you'll understand my precautions. My collection is valuable, and there are those who would steal it." He led them through a maze of corridors, each lined with artifacts, Etruscan vases, Egyptian scarabs, and medieval tapestries. Watson's eyes widened at the display, but Holmes's attention was elsewhere, noting the subtle signs of security, pressure plates beneath rugs, faint tripwires glinting in the candlelight, and the occasional click of a hidden mechanism. The scepter was housed in a glass case within a fortified chamber, its emerald head glowing like a captured star. Holt stood beside it, his posture that of a man guarding a treasure hoard. "The emerald scepter," he announced, his voice reverent, "said to have been wielded by a Pictish king, priceless." Holmes leaned closer, his spectacles catching the light. "Exquisite," he murmured, though his mind was cataloguing the case's lock, a complex mechanism requiring both a key and a combination. He noted, too, the faint scratches around the case's base, suggesting recent tampering. Their tour continued, but Holmes's senses were attuned to the manor's undercurrents. A maid's hurried glance, a locked door that rattled faintly as they passed, the absence of dust in odd corners. These were the threads of a larger tapestry. As Holt droned on about his collection, Holmes slipped away, feigning a need to admire a nearby statue. "Watson," he whispered, rejoining his friend, "this manor is a labyrinth of traps, but the velvet mask has been here. The scratches on the scepter's case are fresh, and I found a velvet thread caught in a hinge near the east wing. They've scouted the terrain." Watson's brow furrowed. "But the scepter's still there. Why not take it?" "Because," Holmes said, his voice low, "the mask is playing chess, not checkers. They want us to believe the scepter is their goal, but I suspect a diversion. Stay alert." Their visit concluded with Holt's grudging offer of tea, which Holmes politely declined, citing a pressing engagement. As they left the manor, Holmes's mind was a whirl of deductions. The velvet mask's presence was undeniable, but their true aim remained elusive. Back in the cab, he pulled a small object from his pocket, a folded note pilfered from a side table during their tour. "Careless of them," Holmes said, unfolding it. The paper bore a single line in elegant script: "The Cove at midnight. Bring the key." A crude map was sketched below, marking a coastal location. Watson leaned over, his eyes widening. "A smuggler's cove?" "Holmes, this could be a trap." "Undoubtedly," Holmes replied, his tone almost cheerful. "But traps, Watson, are two-way streets. The velvet mask expects us to follow. Let us oblige them." The journey to the cove required preparation. Back at Baker Street, Holmes donned a sailor's rough jacket, his face smudged with coal dust to blend with the dockside rabble. Watson, ever the soldier, armed himself with a revolver, though Holmes insisted on discretion. We are observers. Tonight, not combatants, he said. Though his own pocket concealed a small but wickedly sharp knife, the cove lay an hour's ride from London, its cliffs jagged against the moonless sky. The sea roared below, its waves crashing against rocks worn smooth by time. Holmes and Watson crouched behind a cluster of boulders, their breaths visible in the chill air. The fog had followed them, cloaking the cove in a ghostly shroud. At precisely midnight, a lantern's glow pierced the mist. Two figures emerged, one cloaked and hooded, the velvet mask, Holmes was certain. The other was a wiry man, his face obscured by a scarf. They spoke in low tones, their words swallowed by the wind, but Holmes's keen eyes caught the exchange. Of a small object, a key, perhaps the one mentioned in the note. The velvet mask turned, their movements fluid, almost feline. Holmes tensed, ready to pursue, but a sudden crack echoed through the cove, a twig snapping under Watson's boot. The mask's head whipped around, and in an instant they vanished into the fog, leaving the wiry man to scramble away. Holmes cursed softly, but his attention shifted to a small bundle dropped in the mask's haste. He retrieved it, a leather pouch containing a single item, a brass key etched with a raven's head. The key to the scepter's case, Holmes murmured. Or perhaps something more. Back at Baker Street, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in hues of gray and gold. Holmes sat by the fire, the key turning in his fingers. The velvet mask is a step ahead, Watson, but they've made a mistake. This key is a clue to their next move, and the map points to a smuggler's network. We must act swiftly. Watson yawned, his eyes heavy. And Holt's manner? The traps? A fortress, yes, Holmes said, but one already breached. The velvet mask has left their mark, and I suspect they'll return for the scepter soon. We must prepare for the cove's ambush, but first we need a ship. The next day, Holmes secured passage on a small cutter, its captain a grizzled man named Harrow who asked no questions. The sea was rough, the sky heavy with storm clouds, but Holmes's focus was unshakable. As they neared the cove, he outlined his plan. They would pose as smugglers, offering a fabricated tale of stolen goods to draw out the mask's allies. The cove was alive with activity when they arrived, crates stacked along the shore, men moving with practiced efficiency. Holmes, in his sailor's guise, approached a burly smuggler, spinning a tale of a lost shipment. The man's eyes narrowed, but he nodded toward a cave entrance, where a faint light flickered. Inside. The air was damp, the walls slick with algae. Holmes's senses were on edge, every shadow a potential threat. At the cave's heart, a makeshift table held maps and ledgers, one marked with the same raven's head as the key. Before Holmes could investigate further, a blade gleamed in the darkness. A smuggler. Alerted to their presence, Watson's revolver flashed, but Holmes was faster, disarming the man with a precise strike to the wrist. The scuffle was brief, but it drew attention. Shouts echoed, and Holmes grabbed the ledger, pulling Watson toward an exit as footsteps thundered behind them. They emerged into the storm, rain lashing their faces. The cutter was waiting, and Harrow's crew hauled them aboard as the smugglers gave chase. The boat cut through the waves, leaving the cove behind, but Holmes's mind was already elsewhere. Parsing the ledger's contents. Back at Baker Street, the ledger revealed a network of buyers, each linked to the Raven's vault. The scepter, Holmes deduced, was not the final prize but a stepping stone to a larger scheme. The velvet mask was orchestrating a game of misdirection. And the cove was merely one move. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady, "we sail again tomorrow. The mask will not rest, nor shall we. The scepter is their bait, but I intend to be the hook." As the fire crackled, Holmes's eyes burned with resolve. The enigma of the velvet mask was unraveling, thread by thread, and he was determined to see it through to the end. Chapter 8. The Smuggler's Cove. The storm rolled over the jagged cliffs of the Smuggler's Cove, a desolate stretch of coastline where the Thames met the sea in a churning embrace. The wind howled, carrying the tang of salt and the distant rumble of thunder. Sherlock Holmes and Dr. John Watson crouched behind a cluster of weathered rocks, their eyes fixed on the shadowy figures moving in the flickering light of lanterns below. The cove, a natural harbor carved into the cliffs, was alive with activity despite the late hour and the brewing tempest. Boats bobbed against rickety docks, their hulls creaking under the weight of illicit cargo. Holmes's sharp gaze darted from one figure to another, his mind cataloging every detail, the way a man's coat hung unevenly, suggesting a concealed weapon, the hurried whispers that barely reached his ears, the glint of something metallic in the hands of a cloaked figure. "This is no ordinary smuggling operation, Watson," Holmes murmured, his voice low, barely audible over the wind. "The precision, the coordination, it's orchestrated by someone with a keen intellect. The velvet mask is here, I'm certain of it." Watson, his collar turned up against the biting wind, nodded grimly. His hand rested on the revolver in his coat pocket, a precaution Holmes had reluctantly agreed to. "How do you propose we proceed? We're outnumbered, and the storm's not helping." Holmes's lips twitched in a faint smile, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the chase. "Outnumbered, perhaps, but not outwitted. We need only to observe, identify the mask, and secure the emerald scepter before it vanishes into the black market. Patience, Watson. The mask will reveal themselves through action." The duo had arrived at the cove after a harrowing journey from London, following the map Holmes had found hidden in the taunting note left by the velvet mask at Sir Reginald Holt's manor. The map, a delicate piece of parchment with ink that shimmered faintly under candlelight, had marked this cove with a single word: eclipse. Holmes had deduced it referred to a specific time, a lunar eclipse due that night, which would plunge the cove into near-total darkness, perfect for a clandestine operation. They had hired a small boat from a nearby fishing village, navigating the treacherous coastal waters under the guise of night fishermen. Now concealed by the rocks, they watched as the smugglers prepared for what Holmes suspected was the velvet mask's boldest move yet, the theft of the emerald scepter. The cove was a labyrinth of narrow paths and hidden alcoves, its cliffs riddled with caves that had sheltered smugglers for centuries. Lanterns swung from poles, casting erratic shadows on the damp stone walls. Holmes's eyes narrowed as he spotted a figure in a long, dark cloak, moving with purpose toward a small, swift boat moored at the far end of the dock. The figure's movements were fluid, almost theatrical, and a faint glint of green caught the lantern light, a gem, perhaps the scepter itself, clutched in their hand. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing. "That's our quarry. The velvet mask or their agent. Note the posture, confident, yet cautious. They're expecting trouble." Watson squinted through the mist. "Can you be sure it's the scepter?" "It could be any trinket." Holmes shook his head. "The angle Of the light, the size of the object, it matches the scepter's description precisely. Sir Reginald described it as a foot-long rod of gold, topped with an emerald the size of a quail's egg. That glint is unmistakable. The plan was simple but fraught with risk. Holmes intended to ambush the smuggling operation at its peak, when the velvet mask was most distracted by the exchange of goods. He had observed the patterns of the smugglers' movements, noting the rhythm of their work crates loaded, signals given, boats departing in a strict sequence. The key was timing. If they struck too early, the mask might escape with the scepter. Too late, and it would be lost to the sea or a buyer's hands. Holmes gestured for Watson to follow as they crept closer, using the shadows of the cliffs for cover. The storm was intensifying, rain now lashing the rocks, making each step treacherous. Holmes's long coat flapped in the wind, but his focus never wavered. He paused behind a stack of crates, close enough to hear the smugglers' voices now, a mix of coarse Cockney and a smoother, more refined tone that stood out. "Careful. With that crate, you oaf." The refined voice snapped. "It's worth more than your miserable life." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "That voice," he whispered. Cultured, authoritative, yet strained. "The velvet mask is under pressure. This is our moment." Watson gripped his revolver tighter. "What's the signal?" "When I move, you follow. Stay low and aim for the legs if it comes to shooting. We need the mask alive." The smugglers were loading a final crate onto the swift boat, the cloaked figure overseeing the operation with sharp commands. Holmes waited, his body tense, until the figure turned to board the boat. In that moment, he sprang forward, silent, as a shadow, and seized a lantern from a nearby pole. With a swift motion, he hurled it at a pile of crates, the glass shattering and oil igniting in a burst of flame. The smugglers shouted in alarm, scattering as the fire spread, illuminating the cove in a chaotic glow. "Now, Watson." Holmes barked, sprinting toward the boat. The cloaked figure spun, the green glint of the scepter flashing in their hand. Holmes lunged, aiming to tackle them, but the figure was quick, dodging with a grace that confirmed Holmes's suspicions of their skill. The velvet mask leapt onto the boat, cutting the mooring rope with a single slash of a blade. The vessel lurched into the waves, propelled by a waiting oarsman. Watson fired a warning shot into the air, the crack echoing off the cliffs. The smugglers, caught off guard, hesitated, giving Holmes a moment to assess. The boat was pulling away, but the tide was against it, slowing its escape. Holmes scanned the dock, spotting a smaller skiff tied nearby. "Watson, the skiff! We can still catch them." They scrambled into the skiff, Holmes taking the oars while Watson kept his revolver trained on the fleeing boat. The storm battered them, waves crashing over the sides, but Holmes rowed with relentless determination, his eyes locked on the velvet mask's vessel. The eclipse was beginning, the moon's light fading, plunging the cove into an eerie twilight. The mask's boat was a dark silhouette against the churning sea, but Holmes could still see the faint outline of the cloaked figure standing defiantly at the stern. "Holmes, we're gaining." Watson shouted, his voice nearly lost in the chend. "Wind. Steady, Watson. They can't outrun us in this tide." The chase was relentless, the skiff cutting through the waves as Holmes's arms burned with the effort. The velvet mask's boat veered toward a narrow channel between two cliffs, a dangerous passage where the current was fierce. Holmes followed, navigating with a precision born of years of observation and calculation. The channel was a gauntlet of rocks and swirling eddies, but Holmes's focus was unbreakable dot as they closed the gap. The velvet mask turned, raising the scepter as if to taunt them. Then, in a sudden move, the figure tossed something overboard, a small object that glinted briefly before sinking into the dark water. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "A decoy," he muttered. "The scepter is still with them." The chase continued, the boats weaving through the channel until they emerged into open water. The storm was at its peak, lightning cracking across the sky, illuminating the velvet mask's face for a fleeting moment. Holmes caught a glimpse of sharp features, a glint of a silver crescent embroidered on the cloak, confirmation of the mask's identity as the mastermind they'd been hunting. Holmes, "They're heading for that ship." Watson pointed to a larger vessel anchored just beyond the cove, its lights barely visible through the storm. Holmes gritted his teeth. "They mean to transfer the scepter. We can't let them reach it." He rowed harder, closing the distance, but the velvet mask's boat was lighter, its oarsmen skilled. As they neared the ship, the mask stood, shouting orders to the crew. A rope ladder was lowered, and the figure began to climb the scepter. Tucked under one arm, Holmes made a split-second decision. "Watson, take the oars." Watson complied, and Holmes leapt from the skiff, grabbing the ladder just as the mask reached the deck. He climbed swiftly, his coat soaked and heavy, but his movements precise. On the deck, the velvet mask turned, startled, as Holmes emerged from the storm like a specter. "You've led me a merry chase," Holmes said, his voice calm but edged with steel. "But the game ends here." The mask laughed, a low, melodic sound that carried over the wind. "You're persistent, Mr. Holmes, but you're too late." Before Holmes could react, the mask hurled a small object, a smoke bomb. Holmes realized too late. It exploded in a cloud of acrid fog, obscuring the deck. Holmes coughed, his eyes stinging, but he lunged forward, guided by instinct. His hand grazed the mask's cloak, but the figure slipped away, vanishing into the ship's hold. Watson reached the deck, revolver in hand. "Holmes, where are they?" "Below," Holmes shouted, already moving toward the hatch. The ship rocked violently, the storm threatening to tear it from its anchor. They descended into the hold, a maze of crates and barrels, the air thick with the smell of tar and salt. Holmes's eyes adjusted to the dim light, catching a flicker of movement. Cloak disappearing around a corner. They pursued, navigating the narrow passages, but the velvet mask was always a step ahead, leaving behind only faint clues, a velvet thread, a smudge of oil, a whispered taunt echoing in the dark. Holmes's mind raced, piecing together the layout of the hold, predicting the mask's path. He deduced they were heading for a secondary exit, likely a hatch leading to a lifeboat. Watson flanked to the left. Holmes ordered, veering right to cut off the mask's escape. They moved in tandem, their footsteps muffled by the creaking ship. Holmes reached the hatch just as the mask flung it open, revealing the stormy sea beyond. The scepter gleamed in their hand, a beacon in the darkness. "Stop," Holmes commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. The mask hesitated, turning to face him. For a moment, their eyes met sharp, calculating, and oddly familiar. Then, with a defiant smile, the mask leapt into a waiting lifeboat, cutting the ropes and disappearing into the waves. Holmes reached the edge too late, the boat swallowed by the storm. "Damn it!" Watson cursed, joining him. We had them. Holmes's expression was unreadable, his mind already shifting to the next. Move. Not entirely, Watson. Look. He pointed to the deck, where a small object lay, a carved wooden emblem, shaped like a coiled serpent, dropped in the mask's haste. Watson frowned. What is it? A calling card, Holmes said, picking it up. This belongs to Captain Drayton, a notorious smuggler. The velvet mask is working with him, or perhaps for him. This ship, this emblem, it's all connected. The storm raged on, but Holmes's resolve was unshaken. They returned to the skiff, battling the waves back to shore. By the time they reached the cove, the smugglers had scattered, the fire extinguished by the rain. Holmes stood on the cliff, the serpent emblem in his hand, his mind racing through the possibilities. Back in London, after a grueling journey, Holmes and Watson tracked Captain Drayton to a seedy tavern in the East End. The captain, a burly man, with a scarred face and a penchant for rum, was nursing a drink when they cornered him. Holmes wasted no time, slamming the serpent emblem onto the table. Speak. Drayton, Holmes said, his voice low and dangerous. Where is the velvet mask, and what is their game? Drayton's eyes widened, but he recovered quickly, leaning back with a smirk. You're barking up the wrong tree, detective. I run goods, not games. That emblem could belong to anyone. Holmes leaned closer, his gaze piercing. You lie poorly, Captain. The velvet mask used your ship, your men, your routes. You know their identity. Tell me, or I'll ensure Scotland Yard knows every detail of your operations. Drayton's smirk faded. After a tense silence, he leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. The mask ain't one person, detective. They're a shadow, a name passed between players. I don't know their face, but I know they're close to you. Someone you trust, maybe. They've got eyes everywhere. Holmes's jaw tightened, the words striking a chord. He exchanged a glance with Watson, who looked as unsettled as he felt. The idea of betrayal gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the immediate. Where is the scepter now? Drayton shrugged. Gone. Sold. Maybe. The mask don't keep treasures long. They're after something bigger power, not gold. Holmes stood, pocketing the emblem. You've been helpful, Captain. Pray you remain so when I return. As they left the tavern, the rain-soaked streets of London stretched before them, a maze of secrets and shadows. Holmes's mind was a whirlwind, piecing together Drayton's words, the emblem, the mask's taunts. The possibility of betrayal lingered, a bitter undercurrent. Could it be someone in his inner circle, Lestrade? Mrs. Hudson? Even Watson, though the thought was unthinkable? Back at Baker Street, Holmes sat by the fire, the serpent emblem in his hand. Watson poured them both a brandy, his expression grim. What now, Holmes, if the mask is someone we know? Then we trust no one, Holmes said, his voice steady, but his eyes distant. But we're close, Watson. The mask's moves are bold, but they're slipping. The emblem, the scepter, the auction, they're part of a larger design. We'll find them, and we'll unmask them. Chapter 9. The mask unraveled. The fog had lifted from London streets, but a heavier mist seemed to settle over Sherlock Holmes' mind as he sat in his armchair at 221B Baker Street. The gaslight flickered, casting long shadows across the room where papers, ledgers, and the velvet mask with its silver crescent lay strewn across the table. Watson, seated opposite, watched his friend with a mixture of concern and anticipation. Holmes' eyes, sharp as ever, darted between the clues they had amassed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The case of the velvet mask had woven a tangled web, and now, with every thread in his grasp, Holmes was poised to unravel it. The ring they had retrieved from the Raven's vault gleamed faintly in the lamplight, its intricate engravings a silent testament to the jeweler Marcus Vane's craftsmanship. Holmes had spent the early hours of the morning poring over Vane's sketches, the ledger from the docks, and the map found in Sir Reginald Holt's manor. Each clue pointed to a larger scheme, one that extended beyond mere theft. The velvet mask was no ordinary criminal. Their actions suggested a purpose far more intricate than greed. Holmes leaned forward, picking up the velvet mask and turning it over in his hands. The faint scent of jasmine still clung to it, a signature as deliberate as the thief's every move. "Watson," Holmes said abruptly, breaking the silence, "we have been led on a chase, but not without purpose. The velvet mask has orchestrated these events with the precision of a chess master. The diadem, the scepter, the auction, all pieces in a larger game. But to what end?" Watson frowned, adjusting his position in the chair. "You suspect a motive beyond the artifacts themselves." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his voice low. "The thefts are too theatrical, too calculated. The mask leaves clues not out of carelessness, but intent. They wish us to follow, to see. But what are they revealing?" Holmes rose and began pacing, his dressing gown trailing behind him. He stopped at the window, gazing out at the city, where the first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky. The ledger from the docks mentioned payments to a figure known as the Patron. This patron funded the smuggling operation and, I suspect, the thefts themselves. The question is, who stands to gain from such a network? Watson nodded, his mind racing to keep up. "You think the velvet mask is working for this patron?" Holmes shook his head. "Not for Watson. Against. The mask's actions, leaving the mask, the coded messages, the map are designed to expose someone. The thefts are a means to an end, a way to draw attention to a larger corruption." Holmes returned to the table, picking up the ledger. Its pages were filled with cryptic entries, but one name appeared repeatedly in the margins: Lord Bannister. A prominent figure in London's political circles, Bannister was known for his wealth, influence, and impeccable reputation. Yet Holmes' instincts told him that reputations were often the most carefully crafted disguises. "Bannister," Holmes murmured. "He has the means, the connections, and the arrogance to believe himself untouchable. But why would the velvet mask target him?" Watson leaned forward. "You've met Bannister before, haven't you? At one of those society gatherings?" "Briefly," Holmes said, his lips twitching into a faint smile. "A man who speaks much and says little. But his name in this ledger is no coincidence. We must pay him a visit, Watson. If the velvet mask is indeed working to expose him, we may catch them both in one net." The decision made, Holmes and Watson prepared to depart for Bannister's estate in Kensington. The morning was crisp, the streets bustling with vendors and cabs as they hailed a hansom. Holmes sat in silence during the ride, his mind clearly elsewhere, piecing together the final fragments of the puzzle. Watson, accustomed to these moments, watched the city pass by, his hand resting on the revolver in his coat pocket. The velvet mask had proven elusive and dangerous. This confrontation promised to be no less perilous. Bannister's estate was a sprawling affair, its manicured gardens and marble columns a stark contrast to the gritty docks and warehouses where Holmes and Watson had last pursued their quarry. A butler ushered them into a grand drawing-room where Lord Bannister awaited. He was a tall man with silver hair and a demeanor that exuded authority. His smile was polite but guarded as he greeted them. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson," Bannister said, gesturing to a pair of chairs. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Holmes wasted no time. "Lord Bannister, I am investigating a series of thefts involving priceless artifacts. Your name has surfaced in connection with these crimes." Bannister's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Preposterous. I am a collector, yes, but my acquisitions are entirely legitimate. Surely you don't believe these accusations?" "I believe in evidence," Holmes replied coolly, producing the ledger and placing it on the table. "This document details payments to a smuggling operation with your name prominently featured. Care to explain?" Bannister's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, a faint noise, a soft creak, came from the adjacent room. Holmes' head snapped toward the sound, his senses alert. Without a word, he rose and moved toward the door, Watson close behind. Bannister protested, but Holmes ignored him, pushing the door open to reveal a dimly lit study. At its center stood a figure cloaked in black, a velvet mask covering their face. "The velvet mask," Holmes said, his voice steady but laced with excitement. "I had hoped to meet you under less clandestine circumstances." The figure froze, then raised a hand, holding a small pistol. "Stay back, Holmes," came a voice, muffled but unmistakably feminine. "This isn't your fight, isn't it?" Holmes replied, stepping closer despite the weapon. "You've led me on this chase, left clues for me to find. You wanted me here." "Why?" The mask hesitated, her posture tense. "Because you're the only one who can finish this. Bannister is corrupt. He's been funding artifact thefts for years, selling them to private collectors to finance his political schemes. I've been taking them back, exposing his network." Watson glanced at Holmes, surprised by the revelation. "You're saying you're not a thief?" "I'm a thief with a purpose," the mask said, lowering the pistol slightly. "Bannister ruined my family, drove us to ruin to protect his secrets. I want justice." Holmes studied her, his eyes narrowing. "Your ring," he said, pointing to the glinting band on her finger. "It matches the one from the auction. And your voice, there's a cadence to it, a refinement. You're Evelyn Morrow, aren't you? The chemist whose family was disgraced after a scandal involving Bannister's investments." The mask stiffened, then slowly reached up and removed the velvet mask, revealing a woman in her 30s with sharp features and piercing green eyes. Her expression was a mix of defiance and resignation. "You're as clever as they say, Holmes." Bannister, who had followed them into the study, sputtered in outrage. "This is outrageous. This woman is a criminal, a liar." Holmes turned to him, his gaze icy. "And you, Lord Bannister, are a hypocrite. The ledger, the forged museum pass, the payments to smugglers all point to you. Miss Morrow may have broken the law, but her crimes pale in comparison to yours." Evelyn stepped forward, producing a bundle from beneath her cloak, the sapphire diadem and the emerald scepter, gleaming in the dim light. "These belong to the people, not to men like him," she said, her voice trembling with conviction. "I took them to expose him, to show the world what he's done. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "You've made your point, Miss Morrow, but justice must be served through the law, not vengeance. Surrender these artifacts, and I will ensure your story is heard." Evelyn hesitated, her eyes searching Holmes' face. Finally, she handed over the diadem and scepter, her shoulders sagging. "I trust you, Holmes. Do what's right." Watson stepped forward, gently taking the artifacts as Holmes turned to Bannister. "You, sir, will answer to Scotland Yard. I suspect they'll find your accounts rather illuminating." Bannister's face paled, but he said nothing as Holmes signaled to Watson. They escorted Evelyn from the estate, leaving Bannister to face the consequences of his actions. At Scotland Yard, Holmes presented the evidence, ensuring Evelyn's confession was recorded with care. Her motives, rooted in a quest for justice against a man who had destroyed her family, softened the inspector's stance. Holmes argued for leniency, citing her cooperation and the return of the artifacts. As they left the yard, the sun was setting over London, casting a golden glow over the city. Watson glanced at Holmes, who seemed lost in thought. "You believe her, don't you?" Watson asked. "About Bannister, about her family. I believe in truth," Holmes replied. Miss Morrow's actions were misguided, but her intent was not. She exposed a corruption that might have gone unnoticed. In that, she has my respect. They walked in silence for a moment, the weight of the case settling around them. At Baker Street, Holmes paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Watson, there are times when justice requires a touch of mercy. Miss Morrow will face consequences, but I believe she deserves a chance at redemption." Watson nodded, understanding. The rare glimpse into Holmes' compassion. The case of the velvet mask had been a labyrinth of deception, but in its unraveling, Holmes had found not only the truth but a balance between right and wrong. As they stepped inside, the familiar warmth of their rooms enveloped them, and Holmes' eyes gleamed with the promise of the next mystery, already stirring in the shadows of London. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Scotland Yard's investigation into Lord Bannister uncovered a web of corruption that stretched across London's elite, implicating several prominent figures in the artifact trade. The sapphire diadem and emerald scepter were returned to their rightful places, their brilliance undimmed by the chaos they had sparked. Evelyn Morrow, under Holmes' influence, received a reduced sentence, her cooperation noted in the official records. The press, ever eager for scandal, dubbed the case the Enigma of the Velvet Mask, and Watson, true to form, began chronicling the adventure for posterity. Holmes, however, was already looking ahead. The city was never short of mysteries, and the faint rustle of a new letter under the door promised another challenge. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The velvet mask had been unmasked, the truth revealed, and justice, tempered with mercy, had prevailed. As he lit his pipe, the familiar scent of tobacco filled the room, and Holmes smiled faintly, ready for whatever lay beyond the fog. Chapter 10. The Final Thread. The fire in the grate of 21B Baker Street crackled softly, casting a warm glow across the cluttered room. Sherlock Holmes sat in his armchair, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his sharp gray eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The case of the velvet mask had drawn to a close, but its echoes lingered in his mind like the final notes of a symphony, resonant and unresolved. Across from him, Dr. John Watson scribbled diligently in his notebook, the scratch of his pen a steady counterpoint to the fire's murmur. Outside, London hummed with its ceaseless rhythm. Carriages clattered, voices called, and the fog clung to the cobblestones like a conspirator's cloak. The city was at peace, or as close to it as it ever came, and yet Holmes felt the stirrings of something new, a faint thread of intrigue tugging at his restless intellect. The artifacts, the sapphire diadem and the emerald scepter, had been returned to their rightful places. The diadem now gleamed behind reinforced glass in the British Museum, its deep blue facets catching the light with a quiet dignity. The scepter, too, rested securely in Sir Reginald Holt's manor, its emerald heart no longer a target for thieves. Lord Bannister, the corrupt official whose greed had fueled the velvet mask schemes, now languished in a cell, his title stripped, his influence shattered. Evelyn Morrow, the enigmatic chemist who had donned the velvet mask, had confessed her crimes in a quiet, dignified manner, her motives rooted in a personal vendetta against Bannister for the ruin of her family. Holmes had ensured her confession was heard, her sentence softened by the truth of her intentions. Justice had been served, but as always, Holmes found himself lingering on the nuances, the gray spaces between right and wrong. Watson glanced up from his notebook, his brow furrowed. "Holmes, you're uncommonly quiet. The case is solved, the artifacts recovered, and the villain unmasked. Yet you sit there as if the world's still out of joint. What's on your mind?" Holmes's lips twitched into a faint smile. "The world, Watson, is never quite in joint. But you are correct. The case of the velvet mask is concluded. Or rather, it should be. Yet I find myself pondering the threads we leave untied, the questions that linger when the curtain falls." Watson set his pen down, leaning back in his chair. "Threads? What threads?" "Bannister's arrested, Evelyn's confessed, and the stolen goods are back where they belong. You even managed to save that locket for her. A touch of sentiment I didn't expect from you, I'll admit." Holmes's eyes flicked to Watson, a glimmer of amusement in their depths. "Sentiment, Watson, hardly. The locket was of no value. To the case a trinket, nothing more. Its return to Miss Morrow was a matter of practicality. A woman of her intellect, driven to such extremes, deserved a small anchor to her past. It cost nothing to grant it." Watson chuckled, shaking his head. "Call it what you like, Holmes. It was a kind act, and I'll write it as such when I set this case to paper." Holmes waved a dismissive hand. "Write what you will, but spare me the embellishments. The facts are sufficient." "And yet," he trailed off, his gaze returning to the fire, "there is one detail that troubles me. A loose end, if you will." Watson leaned forward, intrigued. "Go on, then. What's this loose end?" Holmes rose abruptly, crossing to the mantel where a small pile of papers lay stacked beside his tobacco pouch. He plucked a single sheet. From the pile a letter, its edges slightly worn, written in a bold, flowing script. "This," he said, holding it up, "delivered this morning, slipped beneath the door as silently as the first note that began this affair. It bears no signature, no crest, yet its tone is unmistakable." Watson took the letter, his eyes scanning the lines. The script was elegant, the words precise. "Mr. Holmes, your pursuit was admirable, your deductions flawless. The game is ended, but the board remains. Should you seek another challenge, look to the shadows of St. Paul's at midnight 3 nights hence. A new player awaits. Yours in respect, a friend." Watson's brow creased. Another cryptic note? Holmes, this could be a prank or a trap. The velvet mask is done. Evelyn's in custody. Who else would play these games with you? Holmes's eyes gleamed with a familiar intensity. Precisely, Watson. Who else? The note's phrasing, its elegance, suggests a mind not unlike Miss Morrow's, yet she is, as you say, in custody. The paper is of fine quality, the ink imported, and the delivery silent. This is no idle prank, it is an invitation. To what? Watson asked, his voice tinged with unease. To another game, Holmes replied, his tone almost eager. The velvet mask was but one piece on a larger board. Consider, Watson, the ledger we found at the docks, the Raven's vault, the network of buyers and smugglers. We dismantled a single thread, but the web remains. Someone, or something, wishes to test me further. Watson sighed, rubbing his temples. You're never satisfied, are you? Most men would take a victory and rest. But you see a closed case and start hunting for shadows. Holmes chuckled, a low, dry sound. Rest is for the dull, Watson. The mind craves stimulation, and this note promises just that. 3 nights hence, at St. Paul's, we shall see what this friend has in store. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparation. Holmes, as was his habit, immersed himself in a whirlwind of activity. He pored over maps of St. Paul's Cathedral and its surrounding alleys, cross-referencing them with police reports of recent thefts and disturbances. He sent telegrams to his network of informants, the irregulars, as he called them, a ragtag group of street urchins who could slip through London's underbelly unnoticed. Watson, meanwhile, ensured their revolvers were cleaned and loaded, though he privately hoped they wouldn't be needed. The memory of the explosion at Marcus Vane's shop lingered, a reminder of the velvet mask's penchant for traps. On the 3rd night, the air was thick with fog, the kind that muffled sound and blurred the edges of reality. St. Paul's loomed ahead, its great dome a shadowy sentinel against the night sky. Holmes and Watson, dressed in dark coats to blend with the gloom, moved silently through the churchyard. The cathedral's steps were deserted, the great doors locked tight. Midnight approached, the distant chime of a clock tower marking the hour. Holmes paused by a stone pillar, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Patience, Watson," he murmured. "Our friend will show themselves." No sooner had he spoken than a figure emerged from the fog, a tall, slender silhouette cloaked in black. The figure moved with a grace that was almost theatrical, pausing beneath a gas lamp. A gloved hand raised a small object, a silver pocket watch, its face catching the light. The figure snapped it shut and slipped it into a pocket, then turned and vanished into an alley. Holmes was already moving, his long strides eating up the distance. Watson followed, his heart pounding. The alley was narrow, its walls slick with damp. The figure's footsteps echoed faintly, leading them deeper into the maze of London's back streets. Holmes's eyes were alight with focus, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. "Note the gate, Watson," he whispered, confident but not hurried. "This is no amateur." The chase led them to a small courtyard where the figure had vanished. In the center stood a single object, a wooden crate, its lid slightly ajar. Holmes approached cautiously, his fingers brushing the wood. Inside was a single item, a velvet glove embroidered with a silver star. Beside it lay a folded note. Holmes unfolded it, his lips curling into a grim smile. "Another breadcrumb," he said, handing it to Watson. Well played, Mr. Holmes. The glove is yours, a token of our dance. Seek the starlight gallery by dawn, and you may find what you seek. But beware, the shadows watch. Watson's jaw tightened. This is madness, Holmes. Another riddle? Another chase? We've only just finished with the last one. Holmes's smile widened. Madness, perhaps, but a madness I understand. Come, Watson. The Starlight Gallery awaits. The Starlight Gallery was a small, private art collection housed in a discreet townhouse in Mayfair. It was known among London's elite for its eclectic mix of paintings and sculptures, many of dubious provenance. Holmes had visited it once before, during a case involving a forged Rembrandt, and he recalled its labyrinthine layout, a perfect place for secrets. They reached the gallery just as the first light of dawn touched the rooftops. The townhouse was dark, its windows shuttered. Holmes picked the lock with practiced ease, and they slipped inside. The air was heavy with the scent of oil paint and old wood. Paintings lined the walls, their subjects ranging from serene landscapes to grim portraits of forgotten nobles. Holmes moved with purpose, his eyes scanning for anything out of place. In a small alcove, he found it, a painting of a masked ball, its figures frozen in mid-dance. One figure, cloaked in black, wore a velvet glove identical to the one in the crate. Holmes tilted the frame, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a small leather-bound book, its pages filled with names, dates, and sums of money, a ledger. Much like the one from the Raven's vault, but far more detailed. Holmes flipped through it, his expression darkening. This is no mere thief's tally, Watson. This is a record of power bribes, blackmail, stolen artifacts sold to the highest bidder. The velvet mask was but a pawn in a larger game. This friend is the true architect. Watson's eyes widened. You mean there's someone above Evelyn Morrow? Someone pulling the strings? Precisely, Holmes said, tucking the ledger into his coat. And they've invited us to play. The question is why? They left the gallery as the city began to stir, the ledger a heavy weight in Holmes's pocket. Back at Baker Street, he spread its pages across the table, his fingers tracing the entries. Names of prominent figures, politicians, merchants. Even a minor royal appeared alongside sums that suggested corruption on a grand scale. One name stood out, the architect, mentioned repeatedly but never identified. Holmes leaned back, lighting his pipe. This is no ordinary criminal, Watson. The architect has woven a network that spans London's elite. The velvet mask was their instrument, but this note, this glove, suggests they seek a new challenge me. Watson frowned. But why you? Why not simply disappear with their profits? Holmes exhaled a plume of smoke. Because, my dear Watson, some minds crave the game as much as I do. The architect is not content with wealth or power. They seek a worthy opponent. And I intend to oblige. The days that followed were a blur of investigation. Holmes dispatched the irregulars to track the names in the ledger, while he and Watson visited informants in London's underworld. Each lead pointed to a shadowy figure who operated through intermediaries, never showing their face. The architect's influence was everywhere: smugglers, forgers, even a corrupt inspector at Scotland Yard. Yet their identity remained elusive. One evening, as Holmes pored over the ledger, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper. This came for you, Mr. Holmes. No sender, just your name. Holmes unwrapped it carefully, revealing a silver key engraved with a star. A note was tucked beneath it. The key to the architect's lair lies in the heart of London. Find the star. Chamber by the new moon, and all will be revealed. Holmes's eyes gleamed. The new moon is tomorrow night. Watson, prepare yourself. We're nearing the endgame. The Star Chamber, as Holmes deduced, was a hidden room beneath the Guildhall. A place whispered of in old texts but long forgotten. Its entrance was concealed behind a false wall in the crypt, accessible only with the right key. Holmes and Watson arrived under cover of darkness, the silver key cold in Holmes's hand. The crypt was silent, its ancient stones exuding a chill that seeped into their bones. The key turned smoothly in a hidden lock, and a panel slid open, revealing a narrow staircase. They descended into a chamber lit by flickering torches. At its center stood a table, and on it a single object, a velvet mask, identical to the one left at the museum, but this one bore a gold star. Behind the table stood a figure, cloaked and hooded, their face obscured. "Welcome, Mr. Holmes," the figure said, their voice low and cultured. "You've played the game well." Holmes stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "The architect, I presume?" The figure inclined their head. "A name, nothing more." "You've uncovered my web, but the question remains, what will you do with it?" Watson's hand rested on his revolver, but Holmes raised a hand to stay him. "You've orchestrated thefts, blackmail, corruption," Holmes said. "Yet you invite me here, not to kill me, but to talk." "Why?" The architect laughed softly. "Because, Mr. Holmes, you are a rarity of mind that matches my own. I tire of pawns. Evelyn was clever, but limited. Bannister was greedy, easily manipulated. But you see the board as I do." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And what is your endgame? Power? Wealth?" "Knowledge," the architect said simply. "The world is a puzzle, and I seek to solve it. You, I suspect, understand that desire." Holmes studied the figure, his mind racing. "You've left clues, breadcrumbs, to draw me here. You want me to join you." The architect's hood shifted, as if they were smiling. "Or to stop me. The choice is yours." Watson stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Holmes, this is madness. This person's a criminal, a manipulator. You can't seriously consider, Holmes." Silenced him with a glance. "The architect's web is vast, Watson. To dismantle it, we must understand it." "But I am not so easily swayed." He turned back to the figure. "You've made one mistake. You underestimated me." In a swift motion, Holmes tossed a small vial from his pocket, a chemical concoction of his own design. It shattered on the London floor, releasing a cloud of choking smoke. The architect staggered back, and Holmes lunged, seizing the hood and pulling it free. The face beneath was unfamiliar, a man in his 40s, with sharp features and eyes that burned with intelligence. Professor Julian Carver, Holmes said, recognizing him from a brief mention in the ledger. "Formerly of Oxford, disgraced. For unethical experiments, you've been hiding in plain sight." Carver smiled, unperturbed. "Well done, Holmes. But you've only seen the surface. My work continues, with or without you." Before Holmes could respond, Carver pressed a hidden switch, and the chamber trembled. A panel slid open, and he vanished into the darkness. Holmes and Watson gave chase, but the passage led to a dead-end trap. Perfectly executed dot back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in silence, the velvet mask with the gold star in his hands. Watson paced, frustrated. He got away, Holmes. After all that, he slipped through your fingers. Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. For now, Watson, but the game is not over. Carver has revealed himself, and that is his first mistake. We have the ledger, the key, and now a name. The architect's web is unraveling. Watson stopped pacing, his expression softening. You let Evelyn keep her locket. Will you let Carver go too? Holmes's eyes darkened. Evelyn sought redemption. Carver seeks only power. He will face justice, Watson, but on my terms. As the fire burned low, Holmes lit his pipe, the smoke curling upward like a question mark. The ledger lay open on the table, its secrets a map to the next challenge. Outside, a new letter arrived, slipped beneath the door, a fresh mystery. A new thread to follow. For now, the enigma of the velvet mask was resolved. But Sherlock Holmes, ever the hunter, was already looking to the shadows.